Chapter 18 of The Dream Doctor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Williams. The Dream Doctor by Arthur B. Reeve. Chapter 18. I followed him in awe as he made a hasty inventory of what we had discovered. There were as many as a dozen finished and partly finished infernal machines of various sizes and kinds, some of tremendous destructive capacity. Kennedy did not even attempt to study them. All about were high explosives, chemicals, dynamite. There was gunpowder of all varieties, antimony, blasting powder, mercury cyanide, chloral hydrate, chlorate of potash, samples of various kinds of shot, some of the outlawed soft-nosed dum-dum bullets, cartridges, shells, pieces of metal purposely left with jagged edges, platinum, aluminum, iron, steel, a conglomerate mass of stuff that would have gladdened an anarchist. Kennedy was examining a little quartz-lined electric furnace, which was evidently used for heating soldering irons and other tools. Everything had been done, it seemed, to prevent explosions. There were no open lights and practically no chance for heat to be communicated far among the explosives. Indeed, everything had been arranged to protect the operator himself in his diabolical work. Kennedy had switched on the electric furnace, and from the various pieces of metal on the table selected several. These he was placing together in a peculiar manner, and to them he attached some copper wire which lay in a corner in a roll. Under the work table, beneath the furnace, one could feel the warmth of the thing slightly. Quickly he took the curious affair, which he had hastily shaped, and fastened it to under the table at that point, then led the wires out through a little barred window to an air shaft, the only means of ventilation of the place except the door. While he was working, I had been gingerly inspecting the rest of the den. In a corner, just beside the door, I had found a set of shelves and a cabinet. On both were innumerable packets done up in white paper. I opened one and found it contained several pinches of a white, crystalline substance. "Little portions of cocaine," commented Kennedy, when I showed him what I had found. In the slang of the fiends, Dex. On the top of the cabinet, he discovered a little enameled box, much like a snuff box, in which there were also some of the white flakes. Quickly he emptied them out and replaced them with others from jars which had not been made up into packets. "Why, there must be hundreds of ounces of the stuff here, to say nothing of the various things they adulterate it with," remarked Kennedy. "No wonder they are so careful when it is a felony, even to have it in your possession in such quantities. See how careful they are about the adulteration, too. You could never tell except from the effect whether it was pure or only few % pure article." Kennedy took a last look at the den to make sure that nothing had been disturbed that would arouse suspicion. "We may as well go," he remarked. "Tomorrow I want to be free to make the connection outside with that wire in the shaft." Imagine our surprise, the next morning, when a tap at our door revealed Lorraine Keith herself. "Is this Professor Kennedy?" she asked, gazing at us with a half-wild expression which she was making a tremendous effort to control. "Because if it is, I have something to tell him that may interest Mr. Carton." We looked at her curiously. Without her makeup she was pallid and yellow in spots, her hands trembling, cold and sweaty, her eyes sunken and glistening, with pupils dilated, her breathing short and hurried, restless, irresolute, and careless of her personal appearance. "Perhaps you wonder how I heard of you, and why I have come to you," she went on. "It is because I have a confession to make. I saw Mr. Haddon just before he was kidnapped." She seemed to hesitate over the word. "How did you know I was interested?" asked Kenny keenly. I heard him mention your name with Mr. Carton's." "Then he knew that I was more than a reporter for the Star," remarked Kennedy. "Kidnapped, you say? How?" She shot a glance half of suspicion, half of frankness at us. "That's what I must confess. Whoever did it must have used me as a tool. Mr. Haddon and I used to be good friends. I would be yet." There was evident feeling in her tone which she did not have to assume. "All I remember yesterday was that, after lunch, I was in the office of the Mayfair when he came in. On his desk was a package. I don't know what has become of it, but he gave one look at it, seemed to turn pale, then caught sight of me. 'Lorraine,' he whispered. 'We used to be good friends. Forgive me for turning you down, but you don't understand. Get me away from here. Come with me. Call a cab.' Well, I got into the cab with him. We had a chauffeur whom we used to have it in the old days. We drove furiously, avoiding the traffic men. He told the driver to take us to my apartment, and that is the last I remember, except a scuffle in which I was dragged from the cab on one side and he on the other." She had opened her handbag and taken from it a little snuff-box, like that which we had seen in the den. I can't go on," she apologized, "without this stuff." "So, you are a cocaine fiend also," remarked Kennedy. "Yes, I can't help it. There is an indescribable excitement to do something great, to make a mark that goes with it. It's soon gone, but while it lasts, I can sing and dance, do anything until every part of my body begins crying for it again. I was full of the stuff when this happened yesterday. Had taken too much, I guess." The change in her after she had snuffed some of the crystals was magical. From a quivering wretch she had become now a self-confident neurasthenic. "You know where that stuff will land you, I presume?" questioned Kennedy. "I don't care," she laughed hollowly. "Yes, I know what you are going to tell me. Soon I'll be hunting for the cocaine bug, as they call it, imagining that in my skin, under the flesh, are worms crawling. Perhaps see them, see the little animals running around and biting me. Oh, you don't know. There are two souls to the cocainist. One is tortured by the suffering which the stuff brings. The other laughs at the fears and pains. But it brings such thoughts. It stimulates my mind, makes it work without, against my will, gives me such visions. Oh, I cannot go on. They would kill me if they knew I had come to you. Why have I? Has not Haddon cast me off? What is he to me now?" It was evident that she was growing hysterical. I wondered whether, after all, the story of the kidnapping of Haddon might not be a figment of her brain, simply an hallucination due to the drug. "They?" inquired Kennedy, observing her narrowly. "Who?" "I can't tell. I don't know. Why did I come? Why did I come?" She was reaching again for the snuff-box, but Kennedy restrained her. "Miss Keith," he remarked, "you are concealing something from me. There is someone," he paused a moment, "whom you are shielding." "No, no," she cried. "He was taken. Brodie had nothing to do with it. Nothing. That is what you mean. I know. This stuff increases my sensitiveness. Yet I hate Coke Brodie. Oh, let me go. I am all unstrung. Let me see a doctor. Tonight, when I am better, I will tell all." Lorraine Keith had torn herself from him, had instantly taken a pinch of the fatal crystals, with that same ominous change from fear to self-confidence. What had been her purpose in coming at all? It had seemed at first to implicate Brodie, but she had been quick to shield him when she saw that danger. I wondered what the fascination might be which the wretch exercised over her. "Tonight. I will see you tonight," she cried, and a moment later she was gone, as unexpectedly as she had come. I looked at Kennedy blankly. "What was the purpose of that outburst?" I asked. "I can't say," he replied. "It was all so incoherent that, from what I know of drug fiends, I am sure she had a deep-laid purpose in it all. It does not change my plans." 2 hours later we had paid a deposit on an empty flat in the tenement house in which the bomb maker had his headquarters, and had received a key to the apartment from the janitor. After considerable difficulty, owing to the narrowness of the air shaft, Kennedy managed to pick up the loose ends of the wire which had been let out of the little window at the base of the shaft, and had attached it to a couple of curious arrangements which he had brought with him. One looked like a large taximeter from a motor cab. The other was a diminutive gas meter, in looks at least. Attached to them were several bells and lights. He had scarcely completed installing the thing, whatever it was, when a gentle tap at the door startled me. Kennedy nodded, and I opened it. It was Carton. "I have had my men watching the Mayfair," he announced. "There seems to be a general feeling of alarm there now. They can't even find Lorraine Keith. Brodie, apparently, has not shown up in his usual haunts since the episode of last night. I wonder if the long arm of this Vice Trust could have reached out and gathered them in, too?" I asked. "Quite likely," replied Carton, absorbed in watching Kennedy. "What's this?" A little bell had tinkled sharply, and a light had flashed up on the attachments to the apparatus. "Nothing. I was just testing to see if it works. It does, although the end which I installed down below was necessarily only a makeshift. It is not this red light with the shrill bell that we are interested in. It is the green light and the low-toned bell. This is a thermopile." "And what is a thermopile?" queried Carton. "For the sake of one who has forgotten his physics," smiled Kennedy, "I may say this is only another illustration of how all science ultimately finds practical application. You probably have forgotten that, when two half-rings of dissimilar metals are joined together, and one is suddenly heated or chilled, there is produced at the opposite connecting point a feeble current which will flow until the junctures are both at the same temperature. You might call this a thermoelectric thermometer, or a telethermometer, or a microthermometer, or any of a dozen names." "Yes," I agreed mechanically, only vaguely guessing at what he had in mind. "The accurate measurement of temperature is still a problem of considerable difficulty," he resumed, adjusting the thermometer. "A heated mass can impart vibratory motion to the ether which fills space, and the wave motions of ether are able to reproduce in other bodies motions similar to those by which they are caused. At this end of the line, I merely measure the electromotive forces developed by the difference in temperature of two similar thermoelectric junctions opposed. We call those junctions in a thermopile couples, and by getting the recording instruments sensitive enough, we can measure 1/1000th of a degree. Becquerel was the first, I believe, to use this property, but the machine which you see here was one recently invented for registering the temperature of sea water, so as to detect the approach of an iceberg. I saw no reason why it should not be used to measure heat as well as cold. You see, down there I place the couples of the thermopile beneath the electric furnace on the table. Here I have the mechanism, operated by the feeble current from the thermopile, opening and closing switches, and actuating bells and lights. Then, too, I have the recording instrument. The thing is fundamentally very simple, and is based on well-known phenomena. It is not uncertain, and can be tested at any time, just as I did then, when I showed a slight fall in temperature. Of course, it is not the slight changes I am after, not the gradual, but the sudden changes in temperature." "I see," said Carton. "If there is a drop, the current goes one way and we see the red light, a rise and it goes the other and we see a green light." "Exactly," agreed Kennedy. "No one is going to approach that chamber downstairs as long as he thinks anyone is watching, and we do not know where they are watching. But the moment any sudden great change is registered, such as turning on that electric furnace, we shall know it here. It must have been an hour that we sat there discussing the merits of the case and speculating on the strange actions of Lorraine Keith. Suddenly, the red light flashed out brilliantly. "What's that?" asked Carton quickly. "I can't tell yet," remarked Kennedy. "Perhaps it is nothing at all. Perhaps it is a draught of cold air from opening the door. We shall have to wait and see." We bent over the little machine, straining our eyes and ears to catch the visual and audible signals which it gave. Gradually, the light faded, as the thermopile adjusted itself to the change in temperature. Suddenly, without warning, a low-toned bell rang before us, and a bright green light flashed up. "That can only have one meaning," cried Craig excitedly. "Someone is down there in that inferno, perhaps the bomb maker himself." The bell continued to ring and the light to glow, showing that whoever was there had actually started the electric furnace. What was he preparing to do? I felt that, even though we knew there was someone there, it did us little good. I, for one, had no relish for the job of bearding such a lion in his den. We looked at Kennedy, wondering what he would do next. From the package in which he had brought the two registering machines, he quietly took another package, wrapped up, about 18 inches long, and apparently very heavy. As he did so, he kept his attention fixed on the telethermometer. Was he going to wait until the bomb maker had finished what he had come to accomplish? It was perhaps 15 minutes after our first alarm that the signals began to weaken. "Does that mean that he is gone? Escaped?" inquired Carton anxiously. "No, it means that his furnace is going at full power and that he has forgotten it. It is what I am waiting for. Come on." Seizing the package as he hurried from the room, Kennedy dashed out on the street and down the outside cellar stairs, followed by us. He paused at the thick door and listened. Apparently, there was not a sound from the other side, except a whir of a motor and a roar which might have been from the furnace. Softly, he tried the door. It was locked on the inside. Was the bomb maker there still? He must be. Suppose he heard us? Would he hesitate a moment to send us all to perdition along with himself? How were we to get past that door? Really, the death-like stillness on the other side was more mysterious than would have been the detonation of some of the criminal's explosive. Kennedy had evidently satisfied himself on one point. If we were going to get into that chamber, we must do it ourselves, and we must do it quickly. From the package which he carried, pulled out a stubby little cylinder, perhaps 18 inches long, very heavy, with a short stump of a lever projecting from one side. Between the stonework of a chimney and the barred door he laid it horizontally, jamming in some pieces of wood to wedge it tighter. Then he began to pump on the handle vigorously. The almost impregnable door seemed slowly to bulge. Still, there was no sign of life from within. Had the bomb maker left before we arrived? "This is my scientific sledgehammer," panted Kennedy, as he worked the little lever backward and forward more quickly. "A hydraulic ram. There is no swinging of axes or wielding of crowbars necessary in breaking down an obstruction like this, nowadays. Such things are obsolete. This little Jimmy, if you want to call it that, has a power of 10 tons. That ought to be enough." It seemed as if the door were slowly being crushed in before the irresistible 10-ton punch of the hydraulic ram. Kennedy stopped. Evidently, he did not dare to crush the door in altogether. Quickly, he released the ram and placed it vertically. Under the now yawning door jamb, he inserted a powerful claw of the ram, and again he began to work the handle. A moment later, the powerful door buckled, and Kennedy deftly swung it outward so that it fell with a crash on the cellar floor. As the noise reverberated, there came a sound of a muttered curse from the cavern. Someone was there. We pressed forward. On the floor, In the weird glare of the little furnace lay a man and a woman, the light playing over their ghastly, set features. Kennedy knelt over the man, who was nearest the door. "Call a doctor, quick," he ordered, reaching over and feeling the pulse of the woman, who had half fallen out of her chair. "They will be all right soon. They took what they thought was their usual adulterated cocaine. See, here's the box in which it was. Instead, I filled the box with the pure drug. They'll come around. Besides, Carton needs both of them in his fight." "Don't take any more," muttered the woman, half conscious. "There's something wrong with it, Haddon." I looked more closely at the face in the half-darkness. It was Haddon himself. "I knew he'd come back when the craving for the drug became intense enough," remarked Kennedy. Carton looked at Kennedy in amazement. Haddon was the last person in the world whom he had evidently expected to discover here. "How? What do you mean?" "The episode of the telephone booth gave me the first hint. That is the favorite stunt of the drug fiend. A few minutes alone, and he thinks no one is the wiser about his habit. Then, too, there was the story about his speed mania. That is a frequent failing of the cocainist. The drug, too, was killing his interest in Lorraine Keith. That is the last stage. Yet, under its influence, just as with the lobbygo and Lieutenant Brodie, he found power and inspiration. With him it took the form of bombs to protect himself in his graft. He can't escape this time. Lorraine, we'll leave it. At his house. You know. Carton." We looked quickly at the work table. On it was a gigantic bomb of clockwork over which Haddon had been working. The cocaine which was to have given him inspiration had, thanks to Kennedy, overcome him. Beside Lorraine Keith were a suitcase and a Gladstone. She had evidently been stuffing the corners full of their favorite nepenthe, for, as Kennedy reached down and turned over the closely packed woman's finery and the few articles belonging to Haddon, innumerable packets from the cabinet dropped out. "Hulloa, what's this?" he exclaimed, as he came to a huge roll of bills and a mass of silver and gold coin. Trying to double-cross us all the time. That was her clever game, to give him the hours he needed to gather what money he could save and make a clean getaway. Even cocaine doesn't destroy the interest of men and women in that, he concluded, turning over to Carton the wealth which Haddon had amassed as one of the meanest grafters of the city of Graft. Here was a case which I could not help letting the Star have immediately. Notes or no notes, it was local news of the first order. Besides, anything that concerned Carton was of the highest political significance. It kept me late at the office, and I overslept. Consequently, I did not see much of Craig the next morning, especially as he told me he had nothing special, having turned down a case of a robbery of a safe, on the ground that the police were much better fitted to catch ordinary yeggmen than he was. During the day, therefore, I helped in directing the following up of the Haddon case for the Star. Then, suddenly, a new front-page story crowded this one of the main headlines. With a sigh of relief, I glanced at the new thriller, found it had something to do with the Navy Department, and that it came from as far away as Washington. There was no reason now why others could not carry on the graft story, and I left, not unwillingly. My special work, just now, was keeping on the trail of Kennedy, and I was glad to go back to the apartment and wait for him. "I suppose you saw that despatch from Washington in this afternoon's papers?" he queried, as he came in, tossing a late edition of the Record down on my desk. Across the front page extended a huge black scarehead. "Navy's most vital secret stolen." "Yes," I shrugged. "But you can't get me much excited by what the rewrite men on the Record say." "Why?" he asked, going directly into his own room. "Well," I replied, glancing through the text of the story, "the actual facts are practically the same as in the other papers. Take this, for instance. On the night of the celebration of the anniversary of the Battle of Manila, there were stolen from the Navy Department plans which the Record learned exclusively represent the greatest naval secret in the world. So much for that paragraph, written in the office. Then it goes on. The whole Secret Service machinery of the government has been put in operation. No one has been able to extract from the authorities the exact secret which was stolen, but it is believed to be an invention which will revolutionize the structure and construction of the most modern monster battleships. Such knowledge, it is said, in the hands of experts, might prove fatal in almost any fight in which our newer ships met others of about equal fighting power, as with it marksmen might direct a shot that would disable our ships. It is the opinion of the experts that the theft was executed by a skilled draftsman or other civilian employee. At any rate, the thief knew what to take and its value. There is, at least one nation, it is asserted, which faces the problem of bringing its ships up to the standard of our own, to which the plans would be very valuable. The building had been thrown open to the public for the display of fireworks on the monument grounds before it. The plans are said to have been on one of the drafting tables, drawn upon linen to be made into blueprints. They are known to have been on the tables when the drafting room was locked for the night. The room is on the third floor of the department, and has a balcony looking out on the monument. Many officers and officials had their families and friends on the balcony to witness the celebration, though it is not known that any one was in the drafting room itself. All were admitted to the building on passes. The plans were tacked to a drafting board in the room, but when it was opened in the morning the linen sheet was gone, and so were the thumbtacks. The plans could readily have been rolled into a small bundle and carried under a coat or a wrap. While the authorities are trying to minimize the actual loss, it is believed that this position is only an attempt to allay the great public concern. I paused. Now then, I added, picking up one of the other papers I had brought uptown myself, take the Express. It says that the plans were important, but would have been made public in a few months anyhow. Here. The theft, or mislaying, as the department hopes it will prove to be, took place several days ago. Official confirmation of the report is lacking, but from trustworthy unofficial sources it is learned that only unimportant parts of plans are missing, presumably minor structural details of battleship construction, and other things of a really trivial character, such as copies of naval regulations, etc. The attempt to make a sensational connection between the loss and a controversy which is now going on with a foreign government is greatly to be deplored, and is emphatically asserted to be utterly baseless. It bears traces to the jingoism of those interests which are urging naval increases. There is usually very little about a battleship that is not known before her keel is laid, or even before the signing of the contracts. At any rate, when it is asserted that the plans represent dernier cri in some form of war preparation, it is well to remember that a last cry is last only until there is a later. Naval secrets are few, anyway, and as it takes some years to apply them, this loss cannot be superlative value to anyone. Still, there is, of course, a market for such information in spite of the progress toward disarmament, but the rule in this case will be the rule as in a horse trade, caveat emptor. So there you are, I concluded. You pay your penny for a paper, and you take your choice. And the Star? Inquired Kennedy, coming to the door and adding with an aggravating grin, the infallible? The Star, I replied, unruffled, hits the point squarely when it says that, whether the plans were of immediate importance or not, the real point is that if they could be stolen, really important things could be taken also. For instance, the thought of what the thief might have stolen has caused much more alarm than the knowledge of what he has succeeded in taking. I think it is about time those people in Washington stopped the leak if— The telephone rang insistently. I think that's for me, exclaimed Craig, bounding out of his room and forgetting his quiz of me. "Hello. Yes. Is that you? Burke, at the Grand Central. Half an hour. All right. I'm bringing Jameson. Goodbye." Kennedy jammed down the receiver on the hook. End of Chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of The Dream Doctor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christoph Stangenberg. The Dream Doctor by Arthur B. Reeve. The Submarine Mystery. "The star was not far from right, Walter," he added seriously. "If the battleship plans could be stolen, other things could be. Other things were. You remember Burke of the Secret Service? I'm going up to Lookout Hill on the Connecticut shore of the Sound with him tonight. The rewrite men on the record didn't have the facts, but they had accurate imaginations. The most vital secret that any navy ever had, that would have enabled us in a couple of years to whip the navies of the world combined against us, has been stolen." "And that is?" I asked. "The practical working out of the newest of sciences, the science of tele-automatics." "Tele-automatics?" I repeated. "Yes. There is something weird fascinating about the very idea. I sit up here safely in this room, turning switches, pressing buttons, depressing levers. 10 miles away, a vehicle, a ship, an aeroplane, a submarine obeys me. It may carry enough of the latest and most powerful explosive that modern science can invent, enough, if exploded, to rival the worst of earthquakes. Yet it obeys my will. It goes where I direct it, it explodes where I want it, and it wipes off the face of the earth anything which I want annihilated. That's tele-automatics, and that is what has been stolen from our Navy, and dimly sensed by you clever newspaper men, from whom even the Secret Service can't quite hide everything. The publication of the rumor alone that the government knows it has lost something has put the Secret Service in a hole. What might have been done quietly and in a few days has got to be done in the glare of the limelight and with the blare of a brass band, and it has got to be done right away, too. Come on, Walter, I've thrown together all we shall need for one night, and it doesn't include any pajamas either." A few minutes later we met our friend Burke of the Secret Service at the new terminal. He had wired Kennedy earlier in the day saying that he would be in New York and would call him up. "The plans that I told you in my message," began Burke, when we had seated ourselves in a compartment of the Pullman, "were those of Captain Shirley, covering the wireless-controlled submarine. The old captain is a thoroughbred, too. I've known him in Washington. Comes of an old New England family with plenty of money, but more brains. For years he has been working on this science of radio tele-automatics, has all kinds of patents which he has dedicated to the United States, too. Of course, the basic pioneer patents are not his. His work has been in the practical application of them. And Kennedy, there are some secrets about this latest work that he has not patented. He has given them outright to the Navy Department because they are too valuable even to patent." Burke, who liked a good detective tale himself, seemed pleased at holding Kennedy spellbound. "For instance," he went on, "he has on the bay up here a submarine which can be made into a crewless dirigible. He calls it the Turtle, I believe, because that was the name of the first American submarine built by Dr. Bushnell during the Revolution, even before Fulton." "You have theories of your own on the case?" asked Craig. "Well, there are several possibilities. You know there are submarine companies in this country, bitter rivals. They might like to have those plans. Then, too, there are foreign governments." He paused. Though he said nothing, I felt that there was no doubt what he hinted at. At least one government occurred to me which would like the plans above all others. "Once some plans of a submarine were stolen, I recall," ruminated Kennedy. "But that theft, I'm satisfied, was committed on behalf of a rival company." "But Kennedy," exclaimed Burke, "it was bad enough when the plans were stolen. Now Captain Shirley wires me that someone must have tampered with his model. It doesn't work right. He even believes that his own life may be threatened. And there's scarcely a real clue, he added dejectedly. Of course, we are watching all the employees who had access to the drafting room and tracing everybody who was in the building that night. I have a complete list of them. There are 3 or 4 who we'll be watching. For instance, there's a young attaché of one of the embassies named Nordheim. Nordheim? I echoed involuntarily. I had expected an Oriental name. Yes, a German. I've been looking up his record, and I find that once he was connected in some way with the famous Titan Iron Works at Kiel, Germany. We began watching him day before yesterday, but suddenly he disappeared. Then there's a society woman in Washington, a Mrs. Bayard Brainard, who was at the department that night. We have been trying to find her. Today I got word that she was summering in the cottage colony across the bay from Lookout Hill. At any rate, I had to go up there to see the captain, and I thought I'd kill a whole flock of birds with one stone. The chief thought, too, that if you take the case with us, you had best start on it up there. Next, you will no doubt want to go back to Washington with me. Lookout Hill was the name of the famous old estate of the Shirleys, on a point of land jutting out into Long Island Sound, and with a neighboring point enclosing a large, deep, safe harbor. On the highest ground of the estate, with a perfect view of both harbor and sound, stood a large stone house, the home of Captain Shirley, of the United States Navy, a retired. Captain Shirley, a man of 62 or 3, bronzed and wiry, met us eagerly. "So, this is Professor Kennedy. I'm glad to meet you, sir," he welcomed, clasping Craig's hand in both of his, a fine figure as he stood erect in the light of the porte cochere. "What's the news from Washington, Burke? Any clues?" "I can hardly tell," replied the Secret Service man, with assumed cheerfulness. "By the way, you'll have to excuse me for a few minutes while I run back into town on a little errand. Meanwhile, Captain, will you explain to Professor Kennedy just how things are? Perhaps he'd better begin by seeing the turtle herself." Burke had not waited longer than to take leave. "The turtle," repeated the captain, leading the way into the house. "Well, I did call it that at first, but I prefer to call it the Z-99. You know, the first submarines, abroad at least, were sometimes called A1, A2, A3, and so on. They were of the diving, plunging type, that is. They submerged on an inclined keel, nose down, like the Hollands. Then came the B-type, in which the hydroplane appeared, the C-type, in which it was more prominent, and D-type, where submergent is on a perfectly even keel, somewhat like our lakes. Well, this boat of mine is the last word, the Z-99. Call it the turtle if you like." We were standing for a moment in a wide colonial hall in which a fire was crackling in a huge brick fireplace, taking the chill off the night air. "Let me give you a demonstration first," added the captain. "Perhaps Z-99 will work, perhaps not." There was an air of disappointment about the old veteran as he spoke, uncertainly now of what, a short time ago, he had known to be a certainty, and one of the greatest it had ever been given the inventive mind of man to know. A slip of a girl entered from the library, saw us, paused, and was about to turn back. Silhouetted against the curtained door, there was health, animation, gracefulness in every line of her wavy chestnut hair, her soft sparkling brown eyes, her white dress and hat to match, which contrasted with the healthy glow of tan on her full neck and arms, and her dainty little white shoes, ready for anything from tennis to tango. "My daughter Gladys. Professor Kennedy and Mr. Jameson," introduced the captain. "We're going to try the Z-99 again, Gladys." A moment later, we 4 were walking to the edge of the cliff, where Captain Shirley had a sort of workshop and signal station. He lighted the gas, for Lookout Hill was only on the edge of the town and boosted gas, electricity, and all modern improvements, as well as the atmosphere of old New England. "The Z-99 is moored just below us, at my private dock," began the captain. "I have a shed down there, where we usually keep her, but I expected you, and she's waiting, thoroughly overhauled. I have signaled to my men, fellows I can trust too, who used to be with me in the Navy, to cast her off. There, now we're ready." The captain turned the switch. Instantly, a couple of 100 feet below us, on the dark and rippling water, a light broke forth. Another signal, and the light changed. It was moving. "The principle of the thing," said Captain Shirley, talking to us by watching the moving light intently, briefly, "is that I use the Hertzian waves to actuate relays on the Z99. That is, I send a child with a message. The grown man, through the relay, so to speak, does the work. So, you see, I can sit up here and send my little David out anywhere to strike down a huge Goliath. I won't bore you yet with explanations of my radio combinator, the telecommutator, the aerial coherer relay, and the rest of the technicalities of wireless control of dirigible, self-propelled vessels. They are well known, beginning with pioneers like Wilson and Gardner in England, Roberts in Australia, Wirth and Leopard in Germany, Gabet in France, and Tesla, Edison, Sims, and the younger Hammond in our own country. The one thing you may not know, that has kept us back while wireless telegraphy has gone ahead so fast, is that in wireless we have been able to discard coherers and relays and use detectors and microphones in their places. But in teleautomatics we have to keep the coherer. That has been the barrier. The coherer only recently has been spasmodic, until we had Hammond's mercury steel disc coherer and now my own. Why, he cried, we are just on the threshold now of this great science which Tesla has named teleautomatics, the electric arm that we can stretch out through space to do our work and fight our battles. It was not difficult to feel the enthusiasm of the captain over an invention of such momentous possibilities, especially as the Z99 was well out in the harbor now, and we could see her flashing her red and green signal lights back to us. "You see," the captain resumed, "I have 12 numbers here on the keys of this radio combinator. Forward, back, stop, propeller motor, rudder right, rudder left, stop steering motor, light signal front, light signals rear, launch torpedoes, and so on. The idea is that of a delayed contact. The machinery is always ready, but it delays a few seconds until the right impulse is given, a purely mechanical problem. I take advantage of the delay to have the message repeated by a signal back to me. I can even change it then. You can see for yourself that it really takes no experience to run the thing when all is going right. Gladys had done it frequently herself. All you have to do is to pay attention and press the right key for the necessary change. It is when things go wrong that even an expert like myself, confound it, there's something wrong." The Z99 had suddenly swerved. Captain Shirley's brow knitted. We gathered around closer, Gladys next to her father and leaning anxiously over the transmitting apparatus. "I wanted to turn her to port, yet she goes to starboard, and signals starboard too. There, now she has stopped altogether. What do you think of that?" Gladys stroked the old seafarer's hand gently as he sat silently at the table, peering with contracted brows out into the now brilliantly moonlit night. Shirley looked up at his daughter, and the lines on his face relaxed as though he would hide his disappointment from her eager eyes. "Confound that light! What's the matter with it?" he exclaimed, changing the subject and glancing up at the gas fixture. Kennedy had already been intently looking at the Welsbach burner overhead, which had been flickering incessantly. "That gas company," added the captain, shaking his head in disgust and showing annoyance over a trivial thing to hide deep concern over a greater, as some men do. "I shall use the electricity altogether after this contract with the company expires. I suppose you literary men, Mr. Jameson, would call that the light that failed." There was a forced air about his attempt to be facetious that did not conceal but rather accentuated the undercurrent of feelings in him. "On the contrary," broke in Kennedy, "I shouldn't be surprised to find that it is the light that succeeded." How do you mean? I wouldn't have said anything about it if you hadn't noticed it yourself. In fact, I may be wrong. It suggests something to me, but it will need a good deal of work to verify it, and then it may not be of any significance. Is that the way the Z99 has behaved always lately? Yes, but I know that she hasn't broken down of herself, Captain Shirley asserted. It never did before, not since I perfected that new coherer, and now it always does, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes after I start her out. Shirley was watching the lights as they serpentined their way to us across the nearly calm water of the bay, idly toying with the now useless combinator. "Wait here," he said, rising hurriedly. "I must send my motorboat out there to pick her up and tow her in." He was gone down the flight of rustic steps on the face of the cliff before we could reply. "I wish Father wouldn't take it to heart so," murmured Gladys. "Sometimes I fear that success or failure of this boat means life or death to him." "That is exactly why we are here," reassured Kennedy, turning earnestly to her. "To help him to settle this thing at once. This is a beautiful spot," he added, as we stood at the edge of the cliff and looked far out over the tossing waves of the Sound. "What is on that other point?" asked Kennedy, turning again toward the harbor itself. "There is a large cottage colony there," she replied. "Of course, many of the houses are still closed so early in the season, but it is a beautiful place in the summer. The hotel over there is open now, though." "You must have a lively time when the season is at its height," ventured Kennedy. "Do you know a cottager there, a Mrs. Brainard?" "Oh, yes, indeed. I have known her in Washington for some time." "No doubt the cottagers envy you your isolation here," remarked Kennedy, turning and surveying the beautifully kept grounds. "I should think it would be pleasant, too, to have an old Washington friend here." "It is. We often invite our friends over for lawn parties and other little entertainments. Mrs. Brainard has just arrived and has only had time to return my first visit to her, but I expect we shall have some good times this summer." It was evident, at least, that Gladys was not concealing anything about her friend, whether there was any suspicions or not of her. We had gone into the house to await the return of Captain Shirley. Berg had just returned, his face betraying that he was bursting with news. "She's here, all right," he remarked in an undertone to Kennedy. "In the Stamford cottage, quite an outfit. French chauffeur, 2 Japanese servants, maids, and all." "The Stamford cottage?" repeated Gladys. "Why, that is where Mrs. Brainard lives." She gave a startled glance at Kennedy as she suddenly seemed to realize that both he and the Secret Service man had spoken about her friend. "Yes," said Berg, noting on the instant the perfect innocence of her concern. "What do you know about Mrs. Brainard? Where is Mr. Brainard?" "Dead, I believe," Gladys hesitated. "Mrs. Brainard has been well known in Washington circles for years. Indeed, I invited her with us the night of the Manila display." "And Mr. Nordheim?" broke in Berg. "No," she hesitated. "He was there, but I don't know as whose guest." "Did he seem very friendly with Mrs. Brainard?" pursued the detective. I thought I saw a shade of relief pass over her face as she answered, "Yes." I could only interpret it that perhaps Nordheim had been attentive to Gladys herself, and that she had not welcomed his attentions. "I may as well tell you," she said at length. "It is no secret in our set, and I suppose you would find it out soon anyhow. It is said that he is engaged to Mrs. Brainard. That is all." "Engaged?" repeated Berg. "Then that would account for his being at the hotel here. At least it would offer an excuse." Gladys was not slow to note the stress that Berg laid on the last word. "Oh, impossible," she began hurriedly. "Impossible that he could have known anything about this other matter. Why, she told me he was to sail suddenly for Germany and came up here for a last visit before he went, and to arrange to come back on his return. Oh, he could know nothing. Impossible." "Why impossible?" persisted Berg. "They have submarines in Germany, don't they? And rival companies, too." "Who have rival companies?" inquired a familiar voice. It was Captain Shirley, who had returned out of breath from his long climb up the stairs from the shore. "The Germans. I was speaking of an attaché named Nordheim." "Who is Nordheim?" inquired the captain. "You met him at the Naval Building that night, don't you remember?" replied Gladys. "Oh yes, I believe I do, dimly. He was the man who seemed so devoted to Mrs. Brainard." "I think he is too, father," she replied hastily. "He has been suddenly called to Berlin and planned to spend the last few days here at the hotel, so as to be near her. She told me that he has been ordered back to Washington again before he sailed, and had to cut his visit short." "When did you first notice the interference with the turtle?" asked Burke. "I received your message this morning." "Yesterday morning was the first," replied the captain. "He arrived the night before and did not leave until yesterday afternoon," remarked Burke. "And we arrived tonight," put in Craig quietly. "The interference is going on yet." "Then the Japs," I cut in, at last giving voice to the suspicion I had of the clever little Orientals. "They could not have stolen the plans," asserted Burke, shaking his head. "No, Nordheim and Mrs. Brainard were the only ones who could have got into the drafting room the night of the Manila celebration." "Burke," said Kennedy, rising, "I wish you would take me into town. There are a few messages I would like to send. You will excuse us, Captain, for a few hours? Good evening, Mrs. Shirley." As he bowed, I heard Kennedy add to her, "Don't worry about your father. Everything will come out all right soon." Outside in the car which Burke had hired, Craig added, "Not to town. That was an excuse not to alarm Miss Shirley too much over her friend. Take us over past the Stamford cottage first." The Stamford cottage was on the beach, between the shore front and the road. It was not a new place, but was built in the hideous style of some 30 years ago, with all sorts of little turned and knobby ornaments. We paused down the road a bit, though not long enough to attract attention. There were lights on every floor of the cottage, although most of the neighboring cottages were dark. "Well protected by lightning rods," remarked Kennedy as he looked the Stamford cottage over narrowly. "We might as well drive on. Keep an eye on the hotel, Burke. It may be that Nordheim intends to return after all." "Assuming that he has left," returned the Secret Service man. "But you said he had left," said Kennedy. "What do you mean?" "I hardly know myself," wearily remarked Burke, on whom the strain of the case, to which we were still fresh, had begun to tell. "I only know that I called up Washington after I heard he had been at the hotel, and no one at our headquarters knew that he had returned. They may have fallen down, but they were to watch both his rooms and the embassy." Mused Kennedy. "Why didn't you say that before?" "Why, I assumed that he had gone back until you told me there was interference tonight too. Now, until I can locate him definitely, I'm all at sea. That's all." It was now getting late in the evening, but Kennedy had evidently no intention of returning yet to Lookout Hill. We paused at the hotel, which was in the center of the cottage colony, and flanked by a hill that ran back of the colony diagonally, and from which a view of both the hotel and the cottages could be obtained. Burke's inquiries developed the fact that Nordheim had left very hurriedly and in some agitation. "To tell you the truth," confided the clerk, with whom Burke had ingratiated himself, "I thought he acted like a man who was watched." Late as it was, Kennedy insisted on motoring to the railroad station and catching the last train to New York. As there seemed to be nothing that I could do at Lookout Hill, I accompanied him on the long and tedious ride, which brought us back to the city in the early hours of the morning. We stopped just long enough to run up to the laboratory and to secure a couple of little instruments which looked very much like small incandescent lamps in a box. Then, by the earliest train from New York, we returned to Lookout Hill, with only such sleep as Kennedy had predicted, snatched in the day coaches of the trains and during a brief wait in the station. A half-hour's freshening up with a dip in the biting cold water of the bay, breakfast with Captain Shirley and Miss Gladys, and a return to the excitement of the case had to serve in place of rest. Burke disappeared, after a hasty conference with Kennedy, presumably to watch Mrs. Brainard at the hotel and the Stamford cottage to see who went in and out. "I've had the Z-99 brought out of its shed," remarked the captain as we rose from the breakfast table. "There was nothing wrong as far as I could discover last night or by a more careful inspection this morning. I'd like to have you take a look at her now, in the daylight." "I was about to suggest," remarked Kennedy as we descended the steps to the shore, "that perhaps first it might be well to take a short run in her with the crew, just to make sure that there is nothing wrong with the machinery." "A good idea," agreed the captain. We came to the submarine, lying alongside the dock and looking like a huge cigar. The captain preceded us down the narrow hatchway, and I followed Craig. The deck was cleared, the hatch closed, and the vessel sealed. End of the submarine mystery.
Chapter 20 of The Dream Doctor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Gurzynski. The Dream Doctor by Arthur B. Reeve. Chapter 20. The Wireless Detector. Remembering Jules Verne's enticing picture of life on the palatial Nautilus, I may as well admit that I was not prepared for a real submarine. My first impression as I entered the hold was that of discomfort and suffocation. I felt, too, that I was too close to too much whirring machinery. I gazed about curiously. On all sides were electrical devices and machines to operate the craft and the torpedoes. I thought also that the water outside was uncomfortably close. One could almost feel it. The Z-99 was low-roofed, damp, with an intricate system of rods, controls, engines, tanks, stopcocks, compasses, gauges, more things than it seemed the human mind, to say nothing of wireless, could possibly attend to at once. "The policy of secrecy which governments keep in regard to submarines," remarked the captain, running his eye over everything at once, it seemed, "has led them to be looked upon as something mysterious. But whatever you may think of teleautomatics, there is really no mystery about an ordinary submarine." I did not agree with our Captain Nemo as, the examination completed, he threw in a switch. The motor started. The Z-99 hummed and trembled. The fumes of gasoline were almost suffocating at first, in spite of the prompt ventilation to clear them off. There was no escape from the smell. I had heard of gasoline heart, but the odor only made me sick and dizzy. Like most novices, I suppose, I was suffering excruciating torture. Not so Kennedy. He got used to it in no time. Indeed, seemed to enjoy the very discomfort. I felt that there was only one thing necessary to add to it, and that was the odor of cooking. Cooking, by the way, on a submarine is uncertain and disagreeable. There was a little electric heater, I found, which might possibly have heated enough water for 1 cup of coffee at a time. In fact, space was economized to the utmost. Only the necessaries of life were there. Every inch that could be spared was given over to machinery. It was everywhere, compact, efficient, everything for running the boat underwater, guiding it above and below, controlling its submersion, compressing air, firing torpedoes, and 1,000 other things. It was wonderful as it was, but when one reflected that all could be done automatically, or rather telautomatically, it was simply astounding. "You see," observed Captain Shirley, "when she is working automatically, neither the periscope nor the wireless mast shows. The wireless impulses are carried down to her from an inconspicuous float which trails along the surface and carries a short aerial with a wire running down like a mast, forming practically invisible antenna." As he was talking, the boat was being trimmed by admitting water as ballast into the proper tanks. "The Z-99, he went on, is a submersible, not a diving submarine. That is to say, the rudder guides it and changes the angle of the boat, but the hydroplanes pull it up and down, 2 pairs of them set fore and aft of the center of gravity. They lift or lower the boat bodily on an even keel, not by plunging and diving. I will now set the hydroplanes at 10 degrees down and the horizontal rudder 2 degrees up, and the boat will submerge to a depth of 30 feet and run constant at that depth." He had shut off the gasoline motor and started the storage battery electric motor, which was used when running submerged. The great motors gave out a strange humming sound. The crew conversed in low, constrained tones. There was a slight perceptible jar, and the boat seemed to quiver just a bit from stem to stern. In front of Shirley was a gauge, which showed the depth of submergence, and a spirit level which showed any inclination. Submerged, he remarked, is like running on the surface under dense fog conditions. I did not agree with those who have said there is no difference running submerged or on the surface. Underway on the surface was one thing, but when we dived it was most unpleasant. I had been reassured at the start when I heard that there were 10 compressed air tanks under a pressure of 2,000 pounds to the square inch. But only once before had I breathed compressed air, and that was when one of our cases once took us down into the tunnels below the rivers of New York. It was not a new sensation, but at 50 feet depth I felt a little tingling all over my body, a pounding of the eardrums, and just a trace of nausea. Kennedy smiled as I moved about. "Never mind, Walter," he said. "I know how you feel on a first trip. One minute you were choking from lack of oxygen, then in another part of the boat you were exhilarated by too much of it. Still," he winked, "don't forget that it is regulated." "Well," I returned, "all I can say is that if war is hell, a submarine is war." I had, however, been much interested in the things about me. Forward, the torpedo discharge tubes and other apparatus about the little doors in the vessel's nose made it look somewhat like a shield, used in boring a tunnel under compressed air. "Ordinary torpedo boats use the regular automobile torpedo," remarked Captain Shirley, coming ubiquitously up behind me. "I improve on that. I can discharge the tele-automobile torpedo and guide it either from the boat, as we are now, or from the land station where we were last night, at will." There was something more than pride in his manner. He was deadly in earnest about his invention. We had come over to the periscope, the eye of the submarine when she is running just under the surface, but of no use that we were below. "Yes," he remarked, in answer to my half-spoken question, "that is the periscope. Usually there is one fixed to look ahead and another that is movable, in order to take in what is on the sides and in the rear. I have both of those. But in addition I have the universal periscope, the eye that sees all around, 360 degrees. A very clever application of an angular prism with objectives, condenser, and 2 eyepieces of low and high power. A call from one of the crew took him into the stern to watch the operation of something, leaving me to myself, for Kennedy was roaming about on a still hunt for anything that might suggest itself. The safety devices, probably more than any other single thing, interested me, for I had read with peculiar fascination of the great disasters to the Lutin, the Pluvios, the Farfadet, the A8, the Foka, the Kambala, the Japanese No. 6, the German U-3, and others. Below us, I knew there was a keel that could be dropped, lightening the boat considerably. Also, there was the submarine bell, immersed in a tank of water, with telephone receivers attached by which one could listen in, for example, before rising, say, from 60 feet to 20 feet, and thus hear the hulls of other ships. The bell was struck by means of air pressure, and was the same as that used for submarine signaling on ships. Water, being dense, is an excellent conductor of sound. Even in the submarine itself I could hear the muffled clang of the gong. Then there were buoys, which could be released and would fly to the surface, carrying with them a telephone, a light, and a whistle. I knew also something of the explosion dangers on a submarine, both from the fuel oil used when running on the surface, and from the storage batteries used when running submerged. Once in a while, a sailor would take from a jar a piece of litmus paper and expose it, showing only a slight discoloration due to carbon dioxide. That was the least of my troubles. For a few moments, also, the white mice in a cage interested me. White mice were carried because they dislike the odor of gasoline and give warning of any leakage by loud squeals. The fact was that there was so much of interest that, the first discomfort over, I was, like Kennedy, beginning really to enjoy the trip. I was startled suddenly to hear the motors stop. There was no more of that interminable buzzing. The Z-99 responded promptly to the air pressure that was forcing the water out of the tanks. The gauge showed that we were gradually rising on an even keel. A man sprang up the narrow hatchway and opened the cover through which we could see a little patch of blue sky again. The gasoline motor was started, and we ran leisurely back to the dock. The trip was over, safely, As we landed, I felt a sense of gladness to get away from that feeling of being cut off from the world. It was not fear of death or of the water, as nearly as I could analyze it, but merely that terrible sense of isolation from man and nature as we know it. A message from Burke was waiting for Kennedy at the wharf. He read it quickly, then handed it to Captain Shirley and myself. "Have just received a telegram from Washington. Great excitement at the embassy. Cipher telegram has been dispatched to the Titan Iron Works. One of my men in Washington reports a queer experience. He had been following one of the members of the embassy staff who saw he was being shadowed, turned suddenly on the man and exclaimed, 'Why are you hounding us still?' What do you make of it? No trace yet of Nordheim. Burke." The lines in Craig's face deepened in thought as he folded the message and remarked abstractedly, "She works all right when you were aboard." Then he recalled himself. "Let us try her again without a crew." 5 minutes later, we had ascended to the aerial conning tower, and all was in readiness to repeat the trial of the night before. Vicious and sly, the Z-99 looked in the daytime as she slipped off under the unseen guidance of the wireless, with death hidden under her nose. Just as during the first trial we had witnessed, she began by fulfilling the highest expectations. Straight as an arrow, she shot out of the harbor's mouth, half submerged, with her periscope sticking up and bearing the flag proudly flapping, leaving behind a wake of white foam. She turned and re-entered the harbor, obeying Captain Shirley's every whim, twisting in and out of the shipping, much to the amazement of the old salts, who had never become used to the weird sight. She cut a figure 8, stopped, started again. Suddenly, I could see by the look on Captain Shirley's face that something was wrong. Before either of us could speak, there was a spurt of water out in the harbor, a cloud of spray, and the Z-99 sank in a mass of bubbles. She had heeled over and was resting on the mud and ooze of the harbor bottom. The water had closed over her, and she was gone. Instantly, all the terrible details of the sinking of the Lutin and other submarines flashed over me. I fancied I could see on the Z-99 the overturned accumulators. I imagined the stifling fumes, the struggle for breath in the suddenly darkened hull. Almost as if it had happened half an hour ago, I saw it. "Thank God for teleautomatics," I murmured as the thought swept over me of what we had escaped. No one was aboard her, at least. Chlorine was escaping rapidly from the overturned storage batteries, for a grave danger lurks in the presence of seawater in a submarine in combination with any of the sulfuric acid. Salt water and sulfuric acid produce chlorine gas, and a pint of it inside a good-sized submarine would be sufficient to render unconscious the crew of a boat. I began to realize the risks we had run, which my confidence in Captain Shirley had minimized. I wondered whether hydrogen in dangerous quantities might not be given off, and with the short-circuiting of the batteries perhaps explode. Nothing more happened, however. All kinds of theories suggested themselves. Perhaps in some way the gasoline motor had been started while the boat was depressed. The gas had escaped, combined with air, and a spark had caused an explosion. There were so many possibilities that it staggered me. Captain Shirley sat stunned. Yet here was the one great question. Whence had come the impulse that had sent the famous Z-99 to her fate? Could it have been through something internal? I asked. Could a current from one of the batteries have influenced the receiving apparatus? "No," replied the captain mechanically. "I have a secret method of protecting my receiving instruments from such impulses within the hull." Kennedy was sitting silently in the corner, oblivious to us up to this point. "But not to impulses from outside the hull," he broke in. Unobserved, he had been bending over one of the little instruments which had kept us up all night and had cost a tedious trip to New York and back. "What's that?" I asked. This is a little instrument known as the Audion, a wireless electric wave detector." "Outside the hull?" repeated Shirley, still dazed. "Yes," cried Kennedy excitedly. "I got my first clue from that flickering Welsbach mantle last night. Of course, it flickered from the wireless we were using, but it kept on. You know, in the gas mantle, there is matter in a most mobile and tenuous state, very sensitive to heat and sound vibrations. Now, the Audion, as you see, consists of 2 platinum wings, parallel to the plane of a bowed filament of an incandescent light in a vacuum. It was invented by Dr. Lee de Forest to detect wireless. When the light is turned on and the little tantalum filament glows, it is ready for business. It can be used for all systems of wireless: singing spark, quenched spark, arc sets, telephone sets. In fact, it will detect a wireless wave from whatever source it is sent. It is so susceptible that a man with one attached to an ordinary steel rod umbrella on a rainy night can pick up wireless messages that are being transmitted within some hundreds of miles radius. The Audion buzzed. There, see? Our wireless is not working, but with the Audion you can see that some wireless is, and a fairly near and powerful source it is too. Kennedy was absorbed in watching the Audion. Suddenly, he turned and faced us. He had evidently reached a conclusion. "Captain," he cried, "can you send a wireless message? Yes? Well, this is to Burke. He is over there, back of the hotel on the hill with some of his men. He has one there who understands wireless, and to whom I have given another Audion. Quick, before this other wireless cuts in on us again. I want others to get the message as well as Burke. Send this. Have your men watch the railroad station and every road to it. Surround the Stamford cottage. There is some wireless interference from that direction." As Shirley, with a half-insane light in his eyes, flashed the message mechanically through space, Craig rose and signaled to the house. Under the porticochery, I saw a waiting automobile, which an instant later tore up the broken stone path and whirled around almost on 2 wheels near the edge of the cliff. Glowing with health and excitement, Gladys Shirley was at the wheel herself. In spite of the tenseness of the situation, I could not help stopping to admire the change in the graceful, girlish figure of the night before, which was now all lithe energy and alertness in her eager devotion to carrying out the minutest detail of Kennedy's plan to aid her father. "Excellent, Miss Shirley," exclaimed Kennedy, "but when I asked Burke to have you keep a car in readiness, I had no idea you would drive it yourself." "I like it," she remonstrated, as he offered to take the wheel. Please, let me drive. I shall go crazy if I'm not doing something. I saw the Z-99 go down. What was it? Who?" "Captain," called Craig. "Quick, into the car. We must hurry. To the Stamford house, Miss Shirley. No one can get away from it before we arrive. It is surrounded." Everything was quiet, apparently, about the house as our wild ride around the edge of the harbor ended under the deft guidance of Gladys Shirley. Here and there, behind a hedge or tree, I could see a lurking Secret Service man. Burke joined us from behind a barn next door. "Not a soul has gone in or out," he whispered. "There does not seem to be a sign of life there." Craig and Burke had by this time reached the broad veranda. They did not wait to ring the bell, but carried the door down literally off its hinges. We followed closely. A scream from the drawing-room brought us to a halt. It was Mrs. Brainerd, tall, almost imperial in her loose morning gown, her dark eyes snapping fire at the sudden intrusion. I could not tell whether she had really noticed that the house was watched or was acting a part. "What does this mean?" she demanded. "What, Gladys, you?" "Florence, tell them. It isn't so, is it? You didn't know a thing about those plans of Father's that were stolen that night." "Where is Nordheim?" interjected Burke quickly, a little of his third-degree training getting the upper hand. "Nordheim?" "Yes, you know. Tell me. Is he here?" "Here? Isn't it bad enough to hound him without hounding me too? Will you merciless detectives drive us all from place to place with your brutal suspicions?" "Merciless?" inquired Burke, smiling with sarcasm. "Who has been hounding him?" "You know very well what I mean," she repeated, drawing herself up to her full height and patting Gladys's hand to reassure her. "Read that message on the table." Burke picked up a yellow telegram dated New York 2 days before. "It was as I feared when I left you. The Secret Service must have rummaged my baggage, both here and at the hotel. They have taken some very valuable papers of mine." "Secret Service? Rummage baggage?" repeated Burke, himself now in perplexity. "That is news to me. We have rummaged no trunks or bags, least of all Nordheim's. In fact, we have never been able to find them at all." "Upstairs, Burke, the servants' quarters," interrupted Craig impatiently. "We are wasting time here." Mrs. Brainerd offered no protest. I began to think that the whole thing was indeed a surprise to her, and that she had in fact been reading instead of making a studied effort to appear surprised at our intrusion. Room after room was flung open without finding anyone until we reached the attic, which had been finished off into several rooms. One door was closed. Craig opened it cautiously. It was pitch dark in spite of the broad daylight outside. We entered gingerly. On the floor lay two dark piles of something. My foot touched one of them. I drew back in horror at the feeling. It was the body of a man. Kennedy struck a light, and as he bent over in its little circle of radiance, he disclosed a ghastly scene. "Harakiri!" he ejaculated. "They must have got my message to Burke and have seen that the house was surrounded." The two Japanese servants had committed suicide. What does it all mean?" gasped Mrs. Brainerd, who had followed us upstairs with Gladys. Burke's lip curled slightly, and he was about to speak. "It means," hastened Kennedy, "that you have been double-crossed, Mrs. Brainerd. Nordheim stole those plans of Captain Shirley's submarine for his Titan Iron Works. Then the Jap stole them from his baggage at the hotel. He thought the Secret Service had them. The Japs waited here just long enough to try the plans against the Z-99 herself, to destroy Captain Shirley's work by his own method of destruction. It was clever. It would make his labors seem like a failure and would discourage others from keeping up the experiments. They had planned to steal a march on the world. Every time the Z-99 was out, they worked up here with their improvised wireless until they found the wavelength Shirley was using. It took 15 or 20 minutes, but they managed, finally, to interfere so that they sent the submarine to the bottom of the harbor. Instead of being the criminal, Burke, Mrs. Brainerd is the victim both of Nordheim and of her servants." Craig had thrown open a window and had dropped down on his knees before a little stove by which the room was heated. He was poking eagerly in a pile of charred paper and linen. "Shirley," he cried, "your secret is safe, even though the duplicate plans were stolen. There will be no more interference." The captain seized Craig by both hands and wrung them like the handle of a pump. "Oh, thank you, cried Gladys, running up and almost dancing with joy at the change in her father. "I could almost kiss you." "I could let you," twinkled Craig promptly as she blushed deeply. "Thank you too, Mrs. Brainerd," he added, turning to acknowledge her congratulations also. "I'm glad I've been able to be of service to you." "Won't you come back to the house for dinner?" urged the captain. Kennedy looked at me and smiled. "Walter," he said, "this is no place for two old bachelors like us." Then turning, he added, "Many thanks, sir, but seriously, last night we slept principally in day coaches. Really, I must turn the case over to Burke now and get back to the city tonight early." They insisted on accompanying us to the station, and there the congratulations were done all over again. "Why," exclaimed Kennedy as we settled ourselves in the Pullman after waving a final goodbye, "I shall be afraid to go back to that town again. I almost did kiss her." Then his face settled into its usual stern lines, although softened, I thought. I am sure that it was not the New England landscape, with its quaint stone fences, that he looked at out of the window, but the recollection of the bright dashing figure of Gladys Shirley. It was seldom that a girl made so forcible an impression on Kennedy, I know, for on our return he fairly dived into work, like the Z-99 herself, and I did not see him all the next day until just before dinner time. Then he came in and spent half an hour restoring his acid-stained fingers to something like human semblance. He said nothing about his research work of the day, and I was just about to remark that a day had passed without its usual fresh alarum and excursion, when a tap on the door buzzer was followed by the entrance of our old friend Andrews, head of the Great Eastern Life Insurance Company's own detective service. "Kennedy," he began, "I have a startling case for you. Can you help me out with it?" As he sat down heavily, he pulled from his immense black wallet some scraps of paper and newspaper cuttings. You recall, I suppose," he went on, unfolding the papers without waiting for an answer, "the recent death of young Montague Phelps at Woodbine just outside the city?" Kennedy nodded. The death of Phelps, about 10 days before, had attracted nationwide attention because of the heroic fight for life he had made against what the doctors admitted had puzzled them, a new and baffling manifestation of coma. They had labored hard to keep him awake, but had not succeeded, and after several days of lying in a comatose state, he had finally succumbed. It was one of those strange but rather frequent cases of long sleeps reported in the newspapers, although it was by no means one which might be classed as record-breaking. The interest in Phelps lay a great deal in the fact that the young man had married the popular dancer Anjanette Petrovska a few months previously. His honeymoon trip around the world had suddenly been interrupted while the couple were crossing Siberia by the news of the failure of the Phelps banking house in Wall Street and the practical wiping out of his fortune. He had returned only to fall a victim to a greater misfortune. "A few days before his death," continued Andrews, measuring his words carefully, "I, or rather the Great Eastern, which had been secretly investigating the case, received this letter. What do you think of it?" He spread out on the table a crumpled note in a palpably disguised handwriting. "To whom it may concern, you would do well to look into the death of Montague Phelps, Jr. I accuse no one, assert nothing. But when a young man, apparently in the best of health, drops off so mysteriously, and even the physician in the case can give no very convincing information, that case warrants attention. I know what I know. An outsider." End of Chapter 20, The Wireless Detector. Recording by Dan Gurzynski. Chapter 21 of The Dream Doctor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Gurzynski. The Dream Doctor by Arthur B. Reeve. Chapter 21, The Ghouls. Mused Kennedy, weighing the contents of the note carefully. "One of the family, I'll be bound, unless the whole thing is a hoax. By the way, who else is there in the immediate family?" "Only a brother, Dana Phelps, younger and somewhat inclined to wildness, I believe. At least his father did not trust him with a large inheritance, but left most of his money in trust. But before we go any further, read that." Andrews pulled from the papers a newspaper cutting on which he had drawn a circle about the following item. As we read, he eyed us sharply. "Phelps tomb desecrated. Last night, John Shaughnessy, a night watchman employed by the town of Woodbine while on his rounds, was attracted by noises as of a violent struggle near the back road in the Woodbine Cemetery on the outskirts of the town. He had varied his regular rounds because of the recent depredations of motor car yeggmen who had timed him in pulling off several jobs lately. As he hurried toward the large mausoleum of the Phelps family, he saw 2 figures slink away in opposite directions in the darkness. One of them, he asserts positively, seemed to be a woman in black. The other, a man whom he could not see clearly. They readily eluded pursuit in the shadows, and a moment later he heard the whir of a high-powered car, apparently bearing them away. At the tomb, there was every evidence of a struggle. Things had been thrown about. The casket had been broken open, but the body of Montague Phelps, Jr., which had been interred there about 10 days ago, was not touched or mutilated. It was a shocking and extraordinary violation. Shaughnessy believes that some personal jewels may have been buried with Phelps and that the thieves were after them, that they fought over the loot, and in the midst of the fight were scared away. The vault is of peculiar construction, a costly tomb in which repose the bodies of the late Montague Phelps Sr., of his wife, and now of his eldest son. The raid had evidently been carefully planned to coincide with a time when Shaughnessy would ordinarily have been on the other side of the town. The entrance to the tomb had been barred, but during the commotion the ghouls were surprised and managed to escape without accomplishing their object and leaving no trace. Mrs. Phelps, when informed of the vandalism, was shocked, and has been in a very nervous state since the tomb was forced open. The local authorities seem extremely anxious that every precaution should be taken to prevent a repetition of the ghoulish visit to the tomb, but as yet the Phelps family has taken no steps. "Are you aware of any scandal, any skeleton in the closet in the family?" asked Craig, looking up. "No, not yet," considered Andrews. "As soon as I heard of the vandalism, I began to wonder what could have happened in the Phelps tomb as far as our company's interests were concerned. You see, that was yesterday. Today this letter came along," he added, laying down a second very dirty and wrinkled note beside the first. It was quite patently written by a different person from the first. Its purport was different, indeed quite the opposite of the other. "It was sent to Mrs. Phelps," explained Andrews, "and she gave it out herself to the police. Do not show this to the police. Unless you leave $5,000 in gold in the old stump in the swamp across from the cemetery, you will have reason to regret it. If you respect the memory of the dead, do this, and do it quietly. Black Hand." "Well," I ejaculated, "that's cool. What threat would be used to back this demand on the Phelpses?" "Here's the situation," resumed Andrews, puffing violently on his inevitable cigar and toying with the letters and clippings. "We have already held up payment of the $500,000 of insurance to the widow as long as we can consistently do so. But we must pay soon, scandal or not, unless we can get something more than mere conjecture." "You are already holding it up?" queried Craig. "Yes. You see, we investigate thoroughly every suspicious death. In most cases, no body is found. This case is different in that respect. There is a body, and it is the body of the insured, apparently. But a death like this, involving the least mystery, receives careful examination, especially if, as in this case, it has recently been covered by heavy policies. My work has often served to reverse the decision of doctors and coroners' juries. An insurance detective, as you can readily appreciate, Kennedy, soon comes to recognize the characteristics in the crimes with which he deals. For example, writing of the insurance plotted for rarely precedes the conspiracy to defraud. That is, I know of few cases in which a policy originally taken out in good faith has subsequently become the means of a swindle. In outright murder cases, the assassin induces the victim to take out insurance in his favor. In suicide cases, the insured does so himself. Just after his return home, young Phelps, who carried $50,000 already, applied for and was granted one of the largest policies we have ever written, $500,000. "Was it incontestable without the suicide clause?" asked Kennedy. "Yes," replied Andrews, "and suicide is the first and easiest theory. Why, you have no idea how common the crime of suicide for the sake of the life insurance is becoming. Nowadays, we insurance men almost believe that everyone who contemplates ending his existence takes out a policy so as to make his life, which is useless to him, a benefit at least to someone, and a nightmare to the insurance detective." "I know," I cut in, for I recalled having been rather interested in the Phelps case at the time, but I thought the doctors said finally that death was due to heart failure. "Dr. Forden, who signed the papers, said so," corrected Andrews. "Heart failure. What does that mean? As well say breath failure or nerve failure. I'll tell you what kind of failure I think it was. It was money failure. Hard times and poor investments struck Phelps before he really knew how to handle his small fortune. It called him home, and poof, he is off, to leave to his family a cool $500,000 by his death. But did he do it himself, or did someone else do it? That's the question." "What is your theory?" inquired Kennedy absently, "assuming there is no scandal hidden in the life of Phelps before or after he married the Russian dancer?" "I don't know, Kennedy," confessed Andrews. "I have had so many theories and have changed them so rapidly that all I lay claim to believing outside of the bald facts that I have stated is that there must have been some poison. I rather sense it, feel that there is no doubt of it, in fact. That is why I have come to you. I want you to clear it up, one way or another. The company has no interest except in getting at the truth." "The body is really there?" asked Kennedy. "You saw it?" It was there no later than this afternoon, and in an almost perfect state of preservation, too. Kennedy seemed to be looking at and through Andrews as if he would hypnotize the truth out of him. "Let me see," he said quickly. "It is not very late now. Can we visit the mausoleum tonight?" "Easily. My car is downstairs. Woodbine is not far, and you'll find it a very attractive suburb aside from this mystery." Andrews lost no time in getting us out to Woodbine, and on the fringe of the little town, one of the wealthiest around the city, he deposited us at the least likely place of all, the cemetery. A visit to a cemetery is none too enjoyable even on a bright day. In the early night it is positively uncanny. What was gruesome in the daylight became doubly so under the shroud of darkness. We made our way into the grounds through a gate, and I, at least, even with all the enlightenment of modern science, could not restrain a weird and creepy sensation. "Here's the Phelps tomb," directed Andrews, pausing beside a marble structure of Grecian lines and pulling out a duplicate key of a new lock which had been placed on the heavy door of grated iron. As we entered, it was with a shudder at the damp odor of decay. Kennedy had brought his little electric bullseye, and as he flashed it about, we could see at a glance that the reports had not been exaggerated. Everything showed marks of a struggle. Some of the ornaments had been broken, and the coffin itself had been forced open. "I have had things kept just as we found them," explained Andrews. Kennedy peered into the broken coffin long and attentively. With a little effort, I, too, followed the course of the circle of light. The body was, as Andrews had said, in an excellent, indeed, a perfect state of preservation. There were, strange to say, no marks of decay. "Strange, very strange," muttered Kennedy to himself. "Could it have been some medical students, body snatchers?" I asked musingly, "or was it simply a piece of vandalism? I wonder if there could have been any jewels buried with him, as Shaughnessy said. That would make the motive plain robbery." "There were no jewels," said Andrews, his mind not on the first part of my question, but watching Kennedy intently. Craig had dropped on his knees on the damp, mildewed floor, and bringing his bullseye close to the stones, was examining some spots here and there. "There could not have been any substitution," I whispered, with my mind still on the broken coffin, "that would cover up the evidence of a poisoning, you know." "No," replied Andrews positively, "although bodies can be obtained cheaply enough from a morgue, ostensibly for medical purposes. No, that is Phelps all right." "Well, then," I persisted, "body snatchers? Medical students?" "Not likely, for the same reason," he rejected. We bent over closer to watch Kennedy. Apparently he had found a number of round, flat spots with little spatters beside them. He was carefully trying to scrape them up with as little of the surrounding mold as possible. Suddenly, without warning, there was a noise outside, as if a person were moving through the underbrush. It was fearsome in its suddenness. Was it human or wraith? Kennedy darted to the door in time to see a shadow glide silently away, lost in the darkness of the fine old willows. Someone had approached the mausoleum for a second time, not knowing we were there, and had escaped. Down the road we could hear the purr of an almost silent motor. "Somebody is trying to get in to conceal something here," muttered Kennedy, stifling his disappointment at not getting a closer view of the intruder. "Then it was not a suicide," I exclaimed. "It was a murder." Craig shook his head sententiously. Evidently he was not prepared yet to talk. With another look at the body and the broken casket, he remarked, "Tomorrow I want to call on Mrs. Phelps and Dr. Forden, and, if it is possible to find him, Dana Phelps. Meanwhile, Andrews, if you and Walter will stand guard here, there is an apparatus which I should like to get from my laboratory and set up here before it is too late." It was far past the witching hour of midnight, when graveyards proverbially yawn, before Craig returned in the car. Nothing had happened in the meantime except those usual eerie noises that one may hear in the country at night anywhere. Our visitor of the early evening seemed to have been scared away for good. Inside the mausoleum, Kennedy set up a peculiar machine which he attached to the electric light circuit in the street by a long wire which he ran loosely over the ground. Part of the apparatus consisted of an elongated box lined with lead, to which were several other attachments, the nature of which I did not understand, and a crank handle. "What's that?" asked Andrews, curiously, as Craig set up a screen between the apparatus and the body. "This is a calcium tungsten screen," remarked Kennedy, adjusting now what I knew to be a Crookes tube on the other side of the body itself, so that the order was the tube, the body, the screen, and the oblong box. Without a further word, we continued to watch him. At last the apparatus adjusted, apparently to his satisfaction. He brought out a jar of thick white liquid and a bottle of powder. "Buttermilk and a couple of ounces of bismuth subcarbonate," he remarked, as he mixed some in a glass and with a pump forced it down the throat of the body, now lying so that the abdomen was almost flat against the screen. He turned a switch, and the peculiar bluish effulgence which always appears when a Crookes tube is being used burst forth, accompanied by the droning of his induction coil and the welcome smell of ozone produced by the electrical discharge in the almost fetid air of the tomb. Meanwhile, he was gradually turning the handle of the crank attached to the oblong box. He seemed so engrossed in the delicateness of the operation that we did not question him. In fact, did not move. For Andrews, at least, it was enough to know that he had succeeded in enlisting Kennedy's services. Well along toward morning it was before Kennedy had concluded his tests, whatever they were, and had packed away his paraphernalia. "I'm afraid it will take me 2 or 3 days to get at this evidence even now," he remarked, impatient at even the limitations science put on his activity. We had started back for a quick run to the city and rest. "But anyhow, it will give us a chance to do some investigating along other lines." Early the next day, in spite of the late session of the night before, Kennedy started me with him on a second visit to Woodbine. This time he was armed with a letter of introduction from Andrews to Mrs. Phelps. She proved to be a young woman of most extraordinary grace and beauty, with a superb carriage, such as only years of closest training under the best dancers in the world could give. There was a peculiar velvety softness about her flesh and skin, a witching stoop to her shoulders that was decidedly continental, and in her deep soulful eyes a half-wistful look that was most alluring. In fact, she was as attractive a widow as the best Fifth Avenue dealers in mourning goods could have produced. I knew that Jeanette Phelps had been, both as dancer and wife, always the center of a group of actors, artists, and men of letters, as well as of the world and affairs. The Phelpses had lived well, although they were not extremely wealthy as fortunes go. When the blow fell, I could well fancy that the loss of his money had been most serious to young Montague, who had showered everything as lavishly as he was able upon his captivating bride. Mrs. Phelps did not seem to be overjoyed at receiving us, yet made no open effort to refuse. "How long ago did the coma first show itself?" asked Kennedy after our introductions were completed. "Was your husband a man of neurotic tendency as far as you could judge?" "Oh, I couldn't say when it began," she answered, in a voice that was soft and musical and under perfect control. "The doctor would know that better. No, he was not neurotic, I think. Did you ever see Mr. Phelps take any drugs? Not habitually, but just before the sleep came on?" Kennedy was seeking his information in a manner and tone that would cause as little offense as possible. "Oh, no," she hastened. "No, never. Absolutely." "You called in Dr. Ford in the last night?" "Yes, he had been Montague's physician many years ago, you know." "I see," remarked Kennedy, who was thrusting about aimlessly to get her off her guard. "By the way, you know there is a great deal of gossip about the almost perfect state of preservation of the body, Mrs. Phelps. I see it was not embalmed." She bit her lip and looked at Kennedy sharply. Why do you and Mr. Andrews worry me? Can't you see Dr. Forden?" In her annoyance, I fancied that there was a surprising lack of sorrow. She seemed preoccupied. I could not escape the feeling that she was putting some obstacle in our way, or that from the day of the discovery of the vandalism, Someone had been making an effort to keep the real facts concealed. Was she shielding someone? It flashed over me that perhaps, after all, she had submitted to the blackmail and had buried the money at the appointed place. There seemed to be little use in pursuing the inquiry, so we excused ourselves, much, I thought, to her relief. We found Dr. Forden, who lived on the same street as the Phelpses, several squares away, most fortunately at home. Forden was an extremely interesting man, as is indeed the rule with physicians. I could not but fancy, however, that his hearty assurance that he would be glad to talk freely on the case was somewhat forced. "You were sent for by Mrs. Phelps that last night, I believe, while Phelps was still alive?" asked Kennedy. "Yes. During the day it had been impossible to arouse him, and that night, when Mrs. Phelps and the nurse found him sinking even deeper into the comatose state, I was summoned again. He was beyond hope then. I did everything I could, but he died a few moments after I arrived." "Did you try artificial respiration?" asked Kennedy. "No," replied Forden. "I telephoned here for my respirator, but by the time it arrived at the house it was too late. Nothing had been omitted while he was still struggling with the spark of life. When that went out, what was the use?" "You were his personal physician?" "Yes." "Had you ever noticed that he took any drug?" Dr. Forden shot a quick glance at Kennedy. "Of course not. He was not a drug fiend." "I didn't mean that he was addicted to any drug, but had he taken anything lately, either of his own volition or with the advice or knowledge of anyone else?" "Of course not." "There's another strange thing I wish to ask your opinion about," pursued Kennedy, not to be rebuffed. "I have seen his body. It is in an excellent state of preservation, almost lifelike, and yet I understand, or at least it seems, that it was not embalmed." "You'll have to ask the undertaker about that," answered the doctor brusquely. It was evident that he was getting more and more constrained in his answers. Kennedy did not seem to mind it, but to me it seemed that he must be hiding something. Was there some secret which medical ethics kept locked in his breast? Kennedy had risen and excused himself. The interviews had not resulted in much. I felt yet Kennedy did not seem to care. Back in the city again, he buried himself in his laboratory for the rest of the day, most of the time in his darkroom, where he was developing photographic plates or films, I did not know which. During the afternoon, Andrews dropped in for a few moments to report that he had nothing to add to what had already developed. He was not much impressed by the interviews. "There's just one thing I want to speak about, though," he said at length, unburdening his mind. "That tomb and the swamp, too, ought to be watched. Last night showed me there seems to be a regular nocturnal visitor, and that we cannot depend on that town night watchman to scare him off. Yet if we watch up there, he will be warned and will lie low. How can we watch both places at once and yet remain hidden?" Kennedy nodded approval at the suggestion. "I'll fix that," he replied, anxious to return to his photographic labors. "Meet me, both of you, on the road from the station at Woodbine, just as it is getting dusk." Without another word, he disappeared into the darkroom. We met him that night, as he had requested. He had come up to Woodbine in the baggage car of the train with a powerful dog, for all the world like a huge gray wolf. "Down, Chef," he ordered, as the dog began to show an uncanny interest in me. "Let me introduce my new dog detective," he chuckled. "She has a wonderful record as a police dog." We were making our way now, through the thickening shadows of the town, to the outskirts. "She's a German sheepdog, a Schäferhund," he explained. "For my part, it is the English bloodhound in the open country and the sheepdog in the city and the suburbs." Chef seemed to have many of the characteristics of the wild prehistoric animal, among them the full upright ears of the wild dog, which are such a great help to it. She was a fine, alert, upstanding dog, hardy, fierce, and literally untiring, of a tawny light brown like a lioness, about the same size and somewhat of the type of the smooth-coated collie, broad of chest and with a full brush of tail. Untamed though she seemed, she was perfectly under Kennedy's control, and rendered him absolute and unreasoning obedience. At the cemetery, we established a strict watch about the Phelps mausoleum and the swamp which lay across the road, not a difficult thing to do as far as concealment went, owing to the foliage. Still, for the same reason, it was hard to cover the whole ground. In the shadow of a thicket, we waited. Now and then we would hear Chef scouting about in the underbrush, crouching and hiding, watching and guarding. As the hours of waiting in the heavily laden night air wore on, I wondered whether our vigil in this weird place would be rewarded. The soughing of the night wind in the evergreens, mournful at best, was doubly so now. Hour after hour we waited patiently. At last there was a slight noise from the direction opposite the mausoleum and toward the swamp next to the cemetery. Kennedy reached out and drew us back into the shadow deeper. "Someone is prowling about, approaching the mausoleum on that side, I think," he whispered. Instantly there recurred to me the thought I had had earlier in the day, that perhaps, after all, the $5,000 of hush money, for whatever purpose it might be extorted, had been buried in the swamp by Mrs. Phelps in her anxiety. Had that been what she was concealing? Perhaps the blackmailer had come to reconnoiter, and, if the money was there, to take it away. Chef, who had been near us, was sniffing eagerly. From our hiding place, we could just see her. She had heard the sounds, too, even before we had, and for an instant stood with every muscle tense. Then, like an arrow, she darted into the underbrush. An instant later, the sharp crack of a revolver rang out. Chef kept right on, never stopping a second except perhaps for surprise. Crack! Almost in her face came a second split of fire in the darkness, and a bullet crashed through the leaves and buried itself in a tree with a ping. The intruder's marksmanship was poor, but the dog paid no attention to it. "One of the few animals that show no fear of gunfire," muttered Kennedy in undisguised admiration. We heard from the police dog. "She has made a leap at the hand that holds the gun," cried Kennedy, now rising and moving rapidly in the same direction. "She has been taught that a man once badly bitten in the hand is nearly out of the fight." We followed, too. As we approached, we were just in time to see Chef running in and out between the legs of a man who had heard us approach and was hastily making tracks for the road. As he tripped, she lunged for his back. Kennedy blew shrilly on a police whistle. Reluctantly, Chef let go. One could see that with all her canine instinct, she wanted to get that man. Her jaws were open as, with longing eyes, she stood over the prostrate form in the grass. The whistle was a signal, and she had been taught to obey unquestioningly. "Don't move until we get to you, or you are a dead man," shouted Kennedy, pulling an automatic as he ran. "Are you hurt?" There was no answer, but as we approached, the man moved ever so little through curiosity to see his pursuers. Chef shot forward again. Again the whistle sounded, and she dropped back. We bent over to seize him as Kennedy secured the dog. "She's a devil!" ground out the prone figure on the grass. "Dana Phelps!" exclaimed Andrews, as the man turned his face towards us. "What are you doing mixed up in this?" Suddenly there was a movement in the rear toward the mausoleum itself. We turned, but it was too late. Two dark figures slunk through the gloom, bearing something between them. Kennedy slipped the leash off Chef, and she shot out like an unchained bolt of lightning. There was the whir of a high-powered machine which must have sneaked up with the muffler on during the excitement. They had taken a desperate chance and had succeeded. They were gone. End of Chapter 21. The Ghouls. Recording by Dan Gurzynski.
Chapter 22 of The Dream Doctor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tommy Hersant, Carlsbad, California. The Dream Doctor by Arthur B. Reeve. The X-Ray Movies. Still holding Dana Phelps between us, we hurried toward the tomb and entered. While our attention had been diverted in the direction of the swamp, the body of Montague Phelps had been stolen. Dana Phelps was still deliberately brushing off his clothes. Had he been in league with them, executing a flank movement to divert our attention? Or had it all been pure chance? "Well?" demanded Andrews. "Well?" demanded Dana. Kennedy said nothing, and I felt that, with our capture, the mystery seemed to have deepened rather than cleared. As Andrews and Phelps faced each other, I noticed that the latter was now and then endeavoring to cover his wrist, where the dog had torn his coat sleeve. "Are you hurt badly?" inquired Kennedy. Dana said nothing, but backed away. Kennedy advanced, insisting on looking at the wounds. As he looked, he disclosed a semicircle of marks. "Not a dog bite," he whispered, turning to me and fumbling in his pocket. "Besides, those marks are a couple of days old. They have scabs on them." He had pulled out a pencil and a piece of paper, and, unknown to Phelps, was writing in the darkness. I leaned over. Near the point in the tube through which the point for writing was protruded a small accumulator and tiny electric lamp, which threw a little disk of light so small that it could be hidden by the hand, yet quite sufficient to guide Craig in moving the point of his pencil for the proper formation of whatever he was recording on the surface of the paper. "An electric light pencil," he remarked laconically in an undertone. "Who were the others?" demanded Andrews of Dana. There was a pause, as though he were debating whether or not to answer at all. "I don't know," he said at length. "I wish I did." "You don't know?" queried Andrews with incredulity. "No, I say I wish I did know. You and your dog interrupted me just as I was about to find out, too." We looked at each other in amazement. Andrews was frankly skeptical of the coolness of the young man. Kennedy said nothing for some moments. "I see you don't want to talk," he put it shortly. "Nothing to talk about," grunted Dana in disgust. "Then why are you here?" "Nothing but conjecture. No facts, only suspicions," said Dana, half to himself. "You expect us to believe that?" insinuated Andrews. "I can't help what you believe. That is the fact." "And you were not with them?" "No." "You'll be within call if we let you go now, any time that we want you?" interrupted Kennedy, much to the surprise of Andrews. "I shall stay in Woodbine as long as there is any hope of clearing up this case. If you want me, I suppose I shall have to stay anyhow, even if there is a clue somewhere else." "I'll take your word for it," offered Kennedy. "I'll give it." I must say that I rather liked the young chap, although I could make nothing out of him. As Dana Phelps disappeared down the road, Andrews turned to Kennedy. "What did you do that for?" he asked, half critically. "Because we can watch him anyway," answered Craig, with a significant glance at the now empty casket. "Have him shadowed, Andrews. It may lead to something, and it may not. But in any case, don't let him get out of reach." "Here we are in a worse mystery than ever," grumbled Andrews. "We have caught a prisoner, but the body is gone, and we can't even show that he was an accomplice." "What were you writing?" I asked Craig, endeavoring to change the subject to one more promising. "Just copying the peculiar shape of those marks on Phelps' arm. Perhaps we can improve on the fingerprint method of identification. Those were the marks of human teeth." He was glancing casually at his sketch as he displayed it to us. I wondered whether he really expected to obtain proof of the identity of at least one of the ghouls by the tooth marks. "It shows 8 teeth, one of them decayed," he remarked. "By the way, there's no use watching here any longer. I have some more work to do in the laboratory, which will keep me another day. Tomorrow night I shall be ready. Andrews, in the meantime, I leave the shadowing of Dana to you, and with the help of Jameson, I want you to arrange to have all those connected with the case at my laboratory tomorrow night without fail." Andrews and I had to do some clever scheming to bring pressure to bear on the various persons interested to ensure their attendance, now that Craig was ready to act. Of course, there was no difficulty in getting Dana Phelps. Andrews' shadows reported nothing in his actions of the following day that indicated anything. Mrs. Phelps came down to town by train, and Dr. Forden motored in. Andrews even took the precaution to secure Shaughnessy and the trained nurse, Miss Tracy, who had been with Montague Phelps during his illness but had not contributed anything toward untangling the case. Andrews and myself completed the little audience. We found Kennedy heating a large mass of some composition, such as dentists used in taking impressions of the teeth. "I shall be ready in a moment." He excused himself, still bending over his Bunsen flame. "By the way, Mr. Phelps, if you will permit me." He had detached a wad of the softened material. Phelps, taken by surprise, allowed him to make an impression of his teeth, almost before he realized what Kennedy was doing. The precedent set, so to speak, Kennedy approached Dr. Forden. He demurred, but finally consented. Mrs. Phelps followed, then the nurse, and even Shaughnessy. With a quick glance at each impression, Kennedy laid them aside to harden. "I am ready to begin," he remarked at length, turning to a peculiar-looking instrument, something like 3 telescopes pointing at a center in which was a series of glass prisms. "These 5 senses of ours are pretty dull detectives sometimes," Kennedy began. "But I find that when we are able to call in outside aid, we usually find that there are no more mysteries." He placed something in a test tube in line before one of the barrels of the telescopes, near a brilliant electric light. "What do you see, Walter?" he asked, indicating an eyepiece. I looked. "A series of lines," I replied. "What is it?" "That," he explained, "is a spectroscope, and those are the lines of the absorption spectrum. Each of those lines, by its presence, denotes a different substance. Now, on the pavement of the Phelps mausoleum I found, you will recall, some roundish spots. I have made a very diluted solution of them, which is placed in this tube. The applicability of the spectroscope to the differentiation of various substances is too well known to need explanation. Its value lies in the exact nature of the evidence furnished. Even the very dilute solution which I have been able to make of the material scraped from these spots gives characteristic absorption bands between the D and E lines, as they are called. Their wavelengths are between 5774 and 5390. It is such a distinct absorption spectrum that it is possible to determine with certainty that the fluid actually contains a certain substance, even though the microscope might fail to give sure proof. Blood, human blood. That was what those stains were. He paused. The spectra of the blood pigments, he added, of the extremely minute quantities of blood and the decomposition products of hemoglobin in the blood are here infallibly shown, varying very distinctly with the chemical changes which the pigments may undergo. Whose blood was it, I asked myself? Was it of someone who had visited the tomb, who was surprised there, or surprised someone else there? I was hardly ready for Kennedy's quick remark. There were 2 kinds of blood there. One was contained in the spots on the floor all about the mausoleum. There are marks on the arm of Dana Phelps, which he probably might say were made by the teeth of my police dog Chef. They are human tooth marks, however. He was bitten by someone in a struggle. It was his blood on the floor of the mausoleum. Whose were the teeth? Kennedy fingered the now-set impressions, then resumed. Before I answer that question, what else does the spectroscope show? I found some spots near the coffin, which had been broken open by a heavy object. It had slipped and had injured the body of Montague Phelps. From the injury, some drops had oozed. My spectroscope tells me that, too, is blood. The blood and other muscular and nervous fluids of the body had remained in an aqueous condition instead of becoming pectus. That is a remarkable circumstance. It flashed over me what Kennedy had been driving at in his inquiry regarding embalming. If the poisons of the embalming fluid had not been injected, he had now clear proof regarding anything his spectroscope discovered. I had expected to find a poison, perhaps an alkaloid, he continued slowly, as he outlined his discoveries by the use of one of the most fascinating branches of modern science, spectroscopy. In cases of poisoning by these substances, the spectroscope often has obvious advantages over chemical methods, for minute amounts will produce a well-defined spectrum. The spectroscope spots the substance, to use a police idiom, the moment the case is turned over to it. There was no poison there. He had raised his voice to emphasize the startling revelation. Instead, I found an extraordinary amount of the substance and products of glycogen. The liver, where this substance is stored, is literally surcharged in the body of Phelps. He had started his moving picture machine. Here I have one of the latest developments in the moving picture art, he resumed. An X-ray moving picture, a feat which was until recently visionary, a science now in its infancy, bearing the formidable names of bioröntgenography or kinematoradiography. Kennedy was holding his little audience breathless as he proceeded. I fancied I could see Anjanette Phelps give a little shudder at the prospect of looking into the very interior of a human body, but she was pale with the fascination of it. Neither Forden nor the nurse looked to the right or to the left. Dana Phelps was open-eyed with wonder. In one X-ray photograph, or even in several, continued Kennedy, it is difficult to discover slight motions. Not so in a moving picture. For instance, here I have a picture which will show you a living body in all its moving details. On the screen before us was projected a huge shadowgraph of a chest and abdomen. We could see the vertebrae of the spinal column, the ribs, and the various organs. It is difficult to get a series of photographs directly from a fluorescent screen, Kennedy went on. I overcome the difficulty by having lenses of sufficient rapidity to photograph even faint images on that screen. It is better than the so-called serial method, by which a number of separate X-ray pictures are taken and then pieced together and rephotographed to make the film. I can focus the X-rays first on the screen by means of a special quartz objective which I have devised. Then I take the pictures. Here, you see, are the lungs in slow or rapid respiration. There is the rhythmically beating heart, distinctly pulsating in perfect outline. There is the liver, moving up and down with the diaphragm, the intestines, and the stomach. You can see the bones moving with the limbs, as well as the inner visceral life. All that is hidden to the eye by the flesh is now made visible in striking manner. Never have I seen an audience at the movies so thrilled as we were now, as Kennedy swayed our interest at his will. I had been dividing my attention between Kennedy and the extraordinary beauty of the famous Russian dancer. I forgot Anjanette Phillips entirely. Kennedy placed another film in the holder. "You are now looking into the body of Montague Phelps," he announced suddenly. We leaned forward eagerly. Mrs. Phelps gave a half-suppressed gasp. What was the secret hidden in it? There was the stomach, a curved sac, something like a bagpipe or a badly made boot, with a tiny canal at the toe connecting it with the small intestine. There were the heart and lungs. "I have rendered the stomach visible," resumed Kennedy, "made it metallic, so to speak, by injecting a solution of bismuth in buttermilk, the usual method by which it becomes more impervious to the X-rays and hence darker in the skiograph. I took these pictures not at the rate of 14 or so a second, like the others, but at intervals of a few seconds. I did that so that, when I run them off, I get a sort of compressed moving picture. What you see in a short space of time actually took much longer to occur. I could have either kind of picture, but I prefer the latter. For you will take notice that there is movement here, of the heart, of the lungs, of the stomach, faint, imperceptible under ordinary circumstances, but nevertheless movement." He was pointing at the lungs. "A single peristaltic contraction takes place normally in a very few seconds. Here it takes minutes. And the stomach, notice what the bismuth picture shows. There is a very slow series of regular wave contractions from the fundus to the pylorus. Ordinarily, one wave takes 10 seconds to traverse it. Here, it is so slow as almost to be unnoticed." What was the implication of his startling, almost gruesome discovery? I saw it clearly, yet hung on his words, afraid to admit even to myself the logical interpretation of what I saw. "Reconstruct the case," continued Craig excitedly. "Mr. Phillips, always a bon vivant, and now so situated by marriage that he must be so, comes back to America to find his personal fortune gone. What was left? He did as many have done. He took out a new large policy on his life. How was he to profit by it? Others have committed suicide, have died to win. Cases are common now, where men have ended their lives under such circumstances by swallowing bichloride of mercury tablets, a favorite method, it seems, lately. But Phelps did not want to die to win. Life was too sweet to him. He had another scheme. Kennedy dropped his voice. One of the most fascinating problems in speculation as to the future of the race under the influence of science is that of suspended animation. The usual attitude is one of reserve or skepticism. There is no necessity for it. Records exist of cases where vital functions have been practically suspended, with no food and little air. Every day, science is getting closer to the control of metabolism. In the trance, the body functions are so slowed as to simulate death. Have you heard of the Indian fakirs who bury themselves alive and are dug up days later? You have doubted it, but there's nothing improbable in it. Experiments have been made with toads, which have been imprisoned in porous rock where they could get the necessary air. They have lived for months in a stupor. In impervious rock, they have died. Frozen fish can revive. Bears and other animals hibernate. There are all gradations from ordinary sleep to the torpor of death. Science can slow down almost to a standstill the vital processes so that excretions disappear and respiration and heartbeat are almost nil. What the Indian fakir does in a cataleptic condition may be duplicated. It is not incredible that they may possess some vegetable extract by which they perform their as yet unexplained feats of prolonged living burial. For if an animal, free from disease, is subjected to the action of some chemical and physical agencies which have the property of reducing to the extreme limit the motor forces and nervous stimulus, the body of even a warm-blooded animal may be brought down to a condition so closely resembling death that the most careful examination may fail to detect any signs of life. The heart will continue working regularly at low tension, supplying muscles and other parts with sufficient blood to sustain molecular life, and the stomach would naturally react to artificial stimulus. At any time before decomposition of tissue has set in, the heart might be made to resume its work and life come back. Phelps had traveled extensively. In Siberia he must undoubtedly have heard of the Buryats, a tribe of natives who hibernate, almost like the animals, during the winters, succumbing to a long sleep known as the leshka. He must have heard of the experiments of Professor Bakhmetev, who studied the Buryats and found that they subsisted on foods rich in glycogen, a substance in the liver which science has discovered makes possible life during suspended animation. He must have heard of anabois, as the famous Russian calls it, by which consciousness can be totally removed and respiration and digestion cease almost completely. But the body is gone, someone interrupted. I turned. It was Dana Phelps, now leaning forward in wide-eyed excitement. "Yes," exclaimed Craig. "Time was passing rapidly. The insurance had not been paid. He had expected to be revived and to disappear with Engineer Phelps long before this. Should the Confederates of Phelps wait? They did not dare. To wait longer might be to sacrifice him, if indeed they had not taken a long chance already. Besides, you yourself had your suspicions and had written the insurance company hinting at murder." Dana nodded, involuntarily confessing. "You were watching them, as well as the insurance investigator, Mr. Andrews. It was an awful dilemma. What was to be done? He must be resuscitated at any risk. Ah, an idea. Rifle the grave. That was the way to solve it. That would still leave it possible to collect the insurance, too. The blackmail letter about the $5,000 was only a blind, to lay on the mythical Black Hand the blame for the desecration. Brought into light, humidity, and warmth, the body would recover consciousness and the life functions resume their normal state after the antibiotic coma into which Phelps had drugged himself. But the very first night the supposed ghouls were discovered. Dana Phelps, already suspicious regarding the death of his brother, wondering at the lack of sentiment which Mrs. Phelps showed, since she felt that her husband was not really dead, Dana was there. His suspicions were confirmed, he thought. Montague had been in reality murdered, and his murderers were now making away with the evidence. He fought with the ghouls, yet apparently, in the darkness, he did not discover their identity. Their struggle was bitter, but they were 2-1. Dana was bitten by one of them. Here are the marks of teeth. Teeth of a woman. Anjanette Phelps was sobbing convulsively. She had risen and was facing Dr. Forden with outstretched hands. "Tell them!" she cried wildly. Forden seemed to have maintained his composure only by a superhuman effort. "The body is at my office," he said, as we faced him with death-like stillness. "Phelps had told us to get him within 10 days. We did get him, finally. Gentlemen, you, who were seeking murderers, are in effect murderers. You kept us away 2 days too long. It was too late. We could not revive him. Phelps is really dead." "The deuce!" exclaimed Andrews. "The policy is incontestable." As he turned to us in disgust, his eyes fell on Anjanette Phelps, sobered down by the terrible tragedy and nearly a physical wreck from real grief. "Still," he added hastily, "we'll pay without a protest." She did not even hear him. It seemed that the butterfly in her was crushed, as Dr. Forden and Miss Tracy gently led her away. They had all left, and the laboratory was again in its normal state of silence, except for the occasional step of Kennedy as he stowed away the apparatus he had used. "I must say that I was one of the most surprised in the room at the outcome of that case," I confessed at length. "I fully expected an arrest." He said nothing, but went on methodically, restoring his apparatus to its proper place. "What a peculiar life you lead, Craig," I pursued reflectively. "One day it is a case that ends with such a bright spot in our lives as the recollection of the Shirleys. The next goes to the other extreme of gruesomeness, and one can hardly think about it without a shudder. And then, through it all, you go with the high-speed power of a racing motor." "Oh, that last case appealed to me. Oh, well, like many others," he ruminated, "just because it was so unusual, so gruesome, as you call it." He reached into the pocket of his coat, hung over the back of a chair. "Now, here's another most unusual case, apparently. It begins really at the other end, so to speak, with the conviction. Begins at the very place where we detectives send a man as the last act of our little dramas." "What?" I gasped. "Another case before even this one is fairly cleaned up? Craig, you are impossible. You get worse instead of better." "Read it," he said simply. Kennedy handed me a letter in the angular hand affected by many women. It was dated at Sing Sing, or rather Ossining. Craig seemed to appreciate the surprise which my face must have betrayed at the curious combination of circumstances. "Nearly always there is the wife or mother of a condemned man who lives in the shadow of the prison. he remarked quietly, adding, "where she can look down at the grim walls, hoping and fearing." I said nothing, for the letter spoke for itself. "I have read of your success as a scientific detective, and hope that you will pardon me for writing to you, but it is a matter of life or death for one who is dearer to me than all the world. Perhaps you recall reading of the trial and conviction of my husband, Sanford Godwin, at East Point. The case did not attract much attention in New York papers, although he was defended by an able lawyer from the city. Since the trial, I have taken up my residence here in Ossining, in order to be near him. As I write, I can see the cold gray walls of the state prison that holds all that is dear to me. Day after day I have watched and waited, hoped against hope. The courts are slow, and lawyers are so technical. There have been executions since I came here, too, and I shudder at them. Will this appeal be denied also? My husband was accused of murdering by poison, hemlock, they alleged, his adoptive parent, the retired merchant Parker Godwin, whose family name he took when he was a boy. After the death of the old man, a later will was discovered in which my husband's inheritance was reduced to a small annuity. The other heirs, the Elmores, asserted, and the state made out its case on the assumption that the new will furnished a motive for killing old Mr. Godwin, and that only by accident had it been discovered. Sanford is innocent. He could not have done it. It is not in him to do such a thing. I am only a woman, but about some things I know more than all the lawyers and scientists, and I know that he is innocent. I cannot write all. My heart is too full. Cannot you come and advise me, even if you cannot take up the case to which I have devoted my life? Tell me what to do. I am enclosing a check for expenses, all I can spare at present. Sincerely yours, Nella Godwin. "Are you going?" I asked, watching Kennedy as he tapped the check thoughtfully on the desk. "I can hardly resist an appeal like that," he replied, absently replacing the check in the envelope with the letter. End of Chapter 22. Recording by Tommy Hersant, Carlsbad, California.
Chapter 23 of The Dream Doctor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dream Doctor by Arthur B. Reeve. Chapter 23. The Death House. In the early forenoon, we were on our way by train up the river to Sing Sing, where, at the station, a line of old-fashioned cabs and red-faced cabbies greeted us, for the town itself is hilly. The house to which we had been directed was on the hill, and from its windows one could look down on the barracks-like pile of stone with the evil, little black barred slits of windows below and perhaps a quarter of a mile away. There was no need to be told what it was. Its very atmosphere breathed the word prison. Even the ugly clutter of tall chimneyed workshops did not destroy it. Every stone, every grill, every glint of a sentry's rifle spelt prison. Mrs. Godwin was a pale, slight little woman, in whose face shone an indomitable spirit, unconquered even by the slow torture of her lonely vigil. Except for such few hours that she had to engage in her simple household duties, with now and then a short walk in the country, she was always watching that bleak stone house of atonement. Yet, though her spirit was unconquered, it needed no physician to tell one that the dimming of the lights at the prison on the morning set for the execution would fill 2 graves instead of 1. for she had come to know that this sudden dimming of the corridor lights, and then their almost as sudden flaring up, had a terrible meaning, well known to the men inside. Hers was no less an agony than that of the men in the curtained cells, since she had learned that when the lights grow dim at dawn at Sing Sing, it means that the electric power has been borrowed for just that little while to send a body straining against the straps of the electric chair, snuffing out the life of a man. Today she had evidently been watching in both directions, watching eagerly the carriages as they climbed the hill, as well as in the direction of the prison. "How can I ever thank you, Professor Kennedy?" she greeted us at the door, keeping back with difficulty the tears that showed how much it meant to have anyone interest himself in her husband's case. There was that gentleness about Mrs. Godwin that comes only to those who have suffered much. "It has been a long fight," she began, as we talked in her modest little sitting room, into which the sun streamed brightly with no thought of the cold shadows in the grim building below. "Oh, and such a hard, heart-breaking fight. Often it seems as if we had exhausted every means at our disposal, and yet we shall never give up. Why cannot we make the world see our case as we see it? Everything seems to have conspired against us, and yet I will not believe that the law and the science that have condemned him are the last words in the law and science." "You said in your letter that the courts were so slow and the lawyers so—" "Yes, so cold, so technical. They do not seem to realize that a human life is at stake. With them it is almost like a game in which we are the pawns, and sometimes I fear, in spite of what the lawyers say, that without some new evidence, it will go hard with them." "You have not given up hope in the appeal?" asked Kennedy gently. "It is merely on technicalities of the law," she replied with quiet fortitude. "That is, as nearly as I can make out from the language of the papers. Our lawyer is Salo Khan of the big firm of criminal lawyers, Smith Khan—" "Conine," mused Kennedy half to himself. I could not tell whether he was thinking of what he repeated or of the little woman. "Yes, the active principle of hemlock," she went on. "That was what the experts discovered. They swore. In the pure state, I believe, it is more poisonous than anything except the cyanides. And it was absolutely scientific evidence. They repeated the tests in court. There was no doubt of it. But, oh, he did not do it. Someone else did it. He did not. He could not." Kennedy said nothing for a few minutes, but from his tone, when he did speak, it was evident that he was deeply touched. "Since our marriage, we lived with old Mr. Godwin in the historic Godwin house at East Point," she resumed as he renewed his questioning. "Sanford, that was my husband's real last name until he came as a boy to work for Mr. Godwin in the office of the factory and was adopted by his employer. Sanford and I kept house for him. About a year ago he began to grow feeble and seldom went to the factory, which Sanford managed for him. One night Mr. Godwin was taken suddenly ill. I don't know how long he had been ill before we heard him groaning, but he died almost before we could summon a doctor. There was really nothing suspicious about it, but there has always been a great deal of jealousy of my husband in the town, and especially among the few distant relatives of Mr. Godwin. What must have started as an idle gossipy rumor developed into a serious charge that my husband had hastened his old guardian's death. The original will, the will, I call it, had been placed in the safe of the factory several years ago. But when the gossip in the town grew bitter, one day when we were out, some private detectives entered the house with a warrant, and they did actually find a will, another will, about which we knew nothing, dated later than the first, and hidden with some papers in the back of a closet, or sort of fireproof box, built into the wall of the library. The second will was identical with the first in language, except that its terms were reversed, and instead of being the residuary legatee, Sanford was given a comparatively small annuity, and the Elmores were made residuary legatees instead of annuitants. "And who are these Elmores?" asked Kennedy curiously. "There are 3, 2 grandnephews and a grandniece, Bradford, Lambert, and their sister Miriam." "And they live?" "In East Point also. Old Mr. Godwin was not very friendly with his sister, whose grandchildren they were. They were the only other heirs living, and although Sanford never had anything to do with them, I think they always imagined that he tried to prejudice the old man against them." I shall want to see the Elmores and at least someone who represents them, as well as the district attorney up there who conducted the case. But now that I am here, I wonder if it is possible that I could bring any influence to bear to see your husband." Mrs. Godwin sighed. "Once a month," she replied, "I leave this window, walk to the prison where the warden is very kind to me, and then I can see Sanford. Of course, there are bars between us besides the regular screen, but I can have an hour's talk, and in those talks he has described to me exactly every detail of his life in the prison. We have even agreed on certain hours when we think of each other. In those hours I know almost what he is thinking." She paused to collect herself. "Perhaps there may be some way if I plead with the warden. Perhaps you may be considered his counsel now. You may see him." A half-hour later we went in the big registry room of the prison and talked with the big-hearted, big-handed warden. Every argument that Kennedy could summon was brought to bear. He even talked over long distance with the lawyers in New York. At last the rules were relaxed, and Kennedy was admitted on some technicality as counsel. Counsel can see the condemned as often as necessary. We were conducted down a flight of steps and past huge steel-barred doors, along corridors, and through the regular prison, until at last we were in what the prison officials call the section for the condemned. Everyone else calls this secret heart of the grim place the death house. It is made up of 2 rows of cells, some 18 or 20 in all, a little more modern in construction than the 1,200 archaic caverns that pass for cells in the main prison. At each end of the corridor sat a guard, armed, with eyes never off the rows of cells day or night. In the wall, on one side, was a door, the little green door, the door from the death house to the death chamber. While Kennedy was talking to the prisoner, a guard volunteered to show me the death chamber and the chair. No other furniture was there in the little brick house of one room except this awful chair, of yellow oak with broad leather straps. There it stood, the sole article in the brightly varnished room of about 25 feet square, with walls of clean blue, this grim acolyte of modern scientific death. There were wet electrodes that are fastened to the legs through slits in the trousers at the calves. Above was the pipe-like fixture, like a gruesome helmet of leather that fits over the head, carrying the other electrode. Back of the condemned was the switch, which lets loose the lethal store of energy, and back of that the prison morgue, where the bodies are taken. I looked about. In the wall to the left toward the death house was also a door, on this side yellow. Somehow I could not get from my mind the fascination of that door, the threshold of the grave. Meanwhile, Kennedy sat in the little cage and talked with the convicted man across the 3-foot distance between cell and screen. I did not see him at the time, but Kennedy repeated afterward what passed, and it so impressed me that I will set it down as if I had been present. Sanford Godwin was a tall, ashen-faced man, in the prison pallor of whose face was written the determination of despair, a man in whose blue eyes was a queer, half-insane light of hope. One knew that if it had not been for the little woman at the window at the top of the hill, the hope would probably long ago have faded. But this man knew she was always there, thinking, watching, eagerly planning, in aid of any new scheme in the long fight for freedom. "The alkaloid was present, that is certain," he told Kennedy. "My wife has told you that. It was scientifically proved. There's no use in attacking that." Later on he remarked, "Perhaps you think it strange that one in the very shadow of the death chair," the word stuck in his throat, "can talk so impersonally of his own case. Sometimes I think it is not my case, but someone else's. And then, that door." He shuddered and turned away from it. On one side was life, such as it was. On the other, instant death. No wonder he pleaded with Kennedy. "Why, Walter," exclaimed Craig as we walked back to the warden's office to telephone to town for a car to take us up to East Point. "Whenever he looks out of that cage, he sees it. He may close his eyes and still see it. When he exercises, he sees it. Thinking by day and dreaming by night, it is always there. Think of the terrible hours that man must pass, knowing of the little woman eating her heart out. Is he really guilty? I must find out. If he is not, I never saw a greater tragedy than this slow, remorseless approach of death in that daily, hourly shadow of the little green door." East Point was a queer old town on the upper Hudson with a varying assortment of industries. Just outside, the old house of the Godwins stood on a bluff overlooking the majestic river. Kennedy had wanted to see it before anyone suspected his mission, and a note from Mrs. Godwin to a friend had been sufficient. Carefully, he went over the deserted and now half-wrecked house, for the authorities had spared nothing in their search for poison, even going over the garden and the lawns in the hope of finding some of the poisonous shrub, hemlock, which it was contended had been used to put an end to Mr. Godwin. As yet nothing had been done to put the house in order again, and as he walked about he noticed a pile of old tins in the yard which had not been removed. Kennedy turned them over with his stick. Then he picked one up and examined it attentively. A blown can, he remarked. Blown? I repeated. Yes, when the contents of a tin begin to deteriorate, they sometimes give off gases which press out the ends of the tin. You can see how these ends bulge. Our next visit was to the district attorney, a young man, Gordon Kilgore, who seemed not unwilling to discuss the case frankly. I want to make arrangements for disinterring the body, explained Kennedy. Would you fight such a move? Not at all, he answered brusquely. Simply make the arrangements through Khan. I shall interpose no objection. It's the strongest, most impregnable part of the case, the discovery of the poison. If you can break that down, you will do more than anyone else has dared to hope. But it can't be done. The proof was too strong. Of course, it's none of my business, but I'd advise some other point of attack. I must confess to a feeling of disappointment when Kennedy announced after leaving Kilgore that, for the present, there was nothing more to be done at East Point until Khan had made the arrangements for reopening the grave. We motored back to Ossining, and Kennedy tried to be reassuring to Mrs. Godwin. By the way, he remarked just before we left, you used a good deal of canned goods at the Godwin house, didn't you? Yes, but not more than other people, I think, she said. Do you recall using any that were, well, perhaps not exactly spoiled, but that had anything peculiar about them? I remember once we thought we found some cans that seemed to have been attacked by mice. At least they smelt so, though how mice could get through a tin can we couldn't see. Mice? Queried Kennedy. Had a mousy smell? That's interesting. Well, Mrs. Godwin, keep up a good heart. Depend on me. What you have told me today has made me more than interested in your case. I shall waste no time in letting you know when anything encouraging develops. Craig had never had much patience with red tape that barred the way to truth, yet there were times when law and legal procedure had to be respected, no matter how much they hampered, and this was one of them. The next day the order was obtained, permitting the opening again of the grave of old Mr. Godwin. The body was exhumed, and Kennedy set about his examination of what secrets it might hide. Meanwhile, it seemed to me that the suspense was terrible. Kennedy was moving slowly, I thought. Not even the courts themselves could have been more deliberate. Also, he was keeping much to himself. Still, for another whole day, there was the slow, inevitable approach of the thing that now I, too, had come to dread, the handing down of the final decision on the appeal. Yet what could Craig do otherwise, I asked myself. I had become deeply interested in the case by this time, and spent the time reading all the evidence, hundreds of pages of it. It was cold, hard, brutal, scientific fact, and as I read, I felt that the hope faded for the ashen-faced man and the pallid little woman. It seemed the last word in science. Was there any way of escape? Impatient as I was, I often wondered what must have been the suspense of those to whom the case meant everything. "How are the tests coming along?" I ventured one night, after Khan had arranged for the uncovering of the grave. It was now 2 days since Kennedy had gone up to East Point to superintend the exhumation, and had returned to the city with the materials, which had caused him to keep later hours in the laboratory than I had ever known even the indefatigable Craig to spend on such a stretch before. He shook his head doubtfully. "Walter," he admitted, "I'm afraid I have reached the limit on the line of investigation I had planned at the start." I looked at him in dismay. "What then?" I managed to gasp. "I'm going up to East Point again tomorrow to look over that house and start a new line. You can go." No urging was needed, and the following day saw us again on the ground. The house, as I have said, had been almost torn to pieces in the search for the will and the poison evidence. As before, we went to it unannounced, and this time we had no difficulty in getting in. Kennedy, who had brought with him a large package, made his way directly to a sort of drawing-room next to the large library, in the closet of which the will had been discovered. He unwrapped the package and took from it a huge brace and bit. The bit, a long, thin, murderous-looking affair, such as might have come from a burglar's kit. I regarded it much in that light. "What's the lay?" I asked as he tapped over the walls to ascertain of just what they were composed. Without a word, he was now down on his knees, drilling a hole in the plaster and lathe. When he struck an obstruction, he stopped, removed the bit, inserted another, and began again. "Are you going to put in a detectaphone?" I asked again. He shook his head. "A detectaphone wouldn't be of any use here," he replied. "No one is going to do any talking in that room." Again the brace and bit were at work. At last the wall had been penetrated, and he quickly removed every trace from the other side that would have attracted attention to a little hole in an obscure corner of the flowered wallpaper. Next he drew out what looked like a long putty blower, perhaps a foot long and 3/8 of an inch in diameter. "What's that?" I asked as he rose after carefully inserting it. "Look through it," he replied simply, still at work on some other apparatus he had brought. I looked. In spite of the smallness of the opening at the other end, I was amazed to find that I could see nearly the whole room on the other side of the wall. "It's a detectascope," he explained, "a tube with a fisheye lens which I had an expert optician make for me." "A fisheye lens?" I repeated. "Yes, the focus may be altered in range so that anyone in the room may be seen and recognized, and any action of his may be detected. The original of this was devised by Galliard Smith, the adapter of the detectaphone. The instrument is something like the cytoscope, which the doctors use to look into the human interior. Now look through it again. Do you see the closet?" Again I looked. "Yes," I said, "but will one of us have to watch here all the time?" He had been working on a black box in the meantime, and now he began to set it up, adjusting it to the hole in the wall which he enlarged on our side. "Now that is my own improvement on it. You remember once we used a quick shutter camera with an electric attachment, which moved the shutter on the contact of a person with an object in the room? Well, this camera has that quick shutter, but in addition, I have adapted to the detectascope an invention by Professor Robert Wood of Johns Hopkins. He has devised a fisheye camera that sees over a radius of 180 degrees, not only straight in front, but over half a circle, every point in that room. You know the refracting power of a drop of water? Since it is a globe, it refracts the light which reaches it from all directions. If it is placed like the lens of a camera, as Dr. Wood tried it, so that one half of it catches the light, all the light caught will be refracted through it. Fishes, too, have a wide range of vision. Some have eyes that see over half a circle, so the lens gets its name. Ordinary cameras, because of the flatness of their lenses, have a range of only a few degrees, the widest in use, I believe, taking in only 96, or a little more than a quarter of a circle. So you see, my detectascope has a range almost twice as wide as that of any other. Though I did not know what he expected to discover, and knew that it was useless to ask, the thing seemed very interesting. Craig did not pause, however, to enlarge on the new machine, but gathered up his tools and announced that our next step would be a visit to a lawyer whom the Elmores had retained as their personal counsel to look after their interests, now that the district attorney seemed to have cleared up the criminal end of the case. Hollins was one of the prominent attorneys of East Point, and before the election of Kilgore as prosecutor had been his partner. Unlike Kilgore, we found him especially uncommunicative and inclined to resent our presence in the case as intruders. The interview did not seem to me to be productive of anything. In fact, it seemed as if Craig were giving Hollins much more than he was getting. "I shall be in town overnight," remarked Craig. "In fact, I am thinking of going over the library up at the Godwin house soon, very carefully." He spoke casually. "There may be, some fingerprints on the walls around that closet, which might prove interesting." A quick look from Hollins was the only answer. In fact, it was seldom that he uttered more than a monosyllable as we talked over the various aspects of the case. A half-hour later, when he had left and had gone to the hotel, I asked Kennedy suspiciously, "Why did you expose your hand to Hollins, Craig?" He laughed. "Oh, Walter," he remonstrated, "don't you know that it is nearly always useless to look for fingerprints, except under some circumstances, even a few days afterward? This is months, not days. Why, on iron and steel they last with tolerable certainty only a short time, and not much longer on silver, glass, or wood, but they are seldom permanent unless they are made with ink or blood or something that leaves a more or less indelible mark. That was a plant." "But what did you expect to gain by it?" "Well," he replied enigmatically, "no one is necessarily honest." It was late in the afternoon when Kennedy again visited the Godwin house and examined the camera. Without a word, he pulled the detectascope from the wall and carried the whole thing to the developing room of the local photographer. There he set to work on the film, and I watched him in silence. He seemed very much excited as he watched the film develop, until at last he held it up, dripping to the red light. "Someone has entered the room this afternoon and attempted to wipe off the walls and woodwork of that closet, as I expected," he exclaimed. "Who was it?" I asked, leaning over. Kennedy said nothing, but pointed to a figure on the film. I bent closer. It was the figure of a woman. "Miriam!" I exclaimed in surprise. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of The Dream Doctor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dream Doctor by Arthur B. Reeve. Chapter 24, The Final Day. I looked aghast at him. If it had been either Bradford or Lambert, both of whom we had come to know since Kennedy had interested himself in the case, or even Hollins or Kilgore, I should not have been surprised. But Miriam? How could she have any connection with the case? I asked, incredulously. Kennedy did not attempt to explain. It is a fatal mistake, Walter, for a detective to assume that he knows what anybody would do in any given circumstances. The only safe course for him is to find out what the persons in question did do. People are always doing the unexpected. This is a case of it, as you see. I am merely trying to get back at facts. Come, I think we might as well not stay overnight after all. I should like to drop off on the way back to the city to see Mrs. Godwin. As we rode up the hill, I was surprised to see that there was no one at the window, nor did anyone seem to pay attention to our knocking at the door. Kennedy turned the knob quickly and strode in. Seated in a chair, as white as a wraith from the grave, was Mrs. Godwin, staring straight ahead, seeing nothing, hearing nothing. "What's the matter?" demanded Kennedy, leaping to her side and grasping her icy hand. The stare on her face seemed to change slightly as she recognized him. "Walter, some water, and a little brandy, if there is any. Tell me, what has happened?" From her lap, a yellow telegram had fluttered to the floor. But before he could pick it up, she gasped, "The appeal, it has been denied." Kennedy picked up the paper. It was a message, unsigned, but not from Kahn, as its wording and, in fact, the circumstances plainly showed. "The execution is set for the week beginning the 5th. She continued, in the same hollow, mechanical voice. "My God, that's next Monday." She had now risen and was pacing the room. No, I'm not going to faint. I wish I could. I wish I could cry. I wish I could do something. Oh, those Elmores, they must have sent it. No one would have been so cruel but they. She stopped and gazed wildly out of the window at the prison. Neither of us knew what to say for the moment. Many times from this window, she cried, I have seen a man walk out of that prison gate. I always watch to see what he does, though I know it is no use. If he stands in the free air, stops short, and looks up suddenly, taking a long look at every house, I hope. But he always turns for a quick backward look at the prison and goes half running down the hill. They always stop in that fashion when the steel door opens outward. Yet I have always looked and hoped, but I can hope no more, no more. The last chance is gone. No, not the last chance, exclaimed Craig, springing to her side lest she should fall. Then he added gently, You must come with me to East Point immediately. What? Leave him here, alone, in his last days? No, 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 never! I must see him. I wonder if they have told him yet. It was evident that she had lost faith in Kennedy, in everybody now. Mrs. Godwin, he urged, come, you must. It is a last chance. Eagerly, he was pouring out the story of the discovery of the afternoon by the little detectascope. Miriam, she repeated, dazed. She? Know anything? It can't be. No, don't raise a false hope now. It is the last chance, he urged again. Come, there is not an hour to waste now. There was no delay, no deliberation about Kennedy now. He had been forced out into the open by the course of events, and he meant to take advantage of every precious moment. Down the hill our car sped to the town, with Mrs. Godwin still protesting but hardly realizing what was going on. Regardless of tolls, Kennedy called up his laboratory in New York and had 2 of his most careful students pack up the stuff which he described minutely to be carried to East Point immediately by train. Kahn, too, was at last found and summoned to meet us there also. Miles never seemed longer than they did to us as we tore over the country from Ossining to East Point, a silent party, yet keyed up by an excitement that none of us had ever felt before. Impatiently, we awaited the arrival of the men from Kennedy's laboratory, while we made Mrs. Godwin as comfortable as possible in a room at the hotel. In one of the parlors, Kennedy was improvising a laboratory as best he could. Meanwhile, Kahn had arrived, and together we were seeking those whose connection with or interest in the case made necessary their presence. It was well along toward midnight before the hasty conference had been gathered. Besides Mrs. Godwin, Solo Kahn, and ourselves, the 3 Elmores, Kilgore, and Hollands. Strange though it was, the room seemed to me almost to have assumed the familiar look of the laboratory in New York. There was the same clutter of tubes and jars on the tables, but above all that, same feeling of suspense in the air, which I had come to associate with the clearing up of a case. There was something else in the air, too. It was a peculiar mousy smell, disagreeable, and one which made it a relief to have Kennedy begin in a low voice to tell why he had called us together so hastily. I shall start, announced Kennedy, at the point where the state left off with the proof that Mr. Godwin died of quinine or hemlock poisoning.
Quinine, as every chemist knows, has a long and well-known history. It was the first alkaloid to be synthesized. Here is a sample, this colorless, oily fluid. No doubt you have noticed the mousy odor in this room. As little as 1 part of quinine to 50,000 of water gives off that odor. It is characteristic. I have proceeded with extraordinary caution in my investigation of this case, he went on. In fact, there would have been no value in it otherwise, for the experts for the people seem to have established the presence of quinine in the body with absolute certainty. He paused, and we waited expectantly. I have had the body exhumed, and have repeated the tests. The alkaloid which I discovered had given precisely the same results as in their tests. My heart sank. What was he doing? Convicting the man over again? There is one other test which I tried, he continued, but which I cannot take time to duplicate tonight. It was testified at the trial that quinine, the active principle of hemlock, is intensely poisonous. No chemical antidote is known. 1/5 of a grain has serious results. A drop is fatal. An injection of a most minute quantity of real quinine will kill a mouse, for instance, almost instantly. But the quinine which I have isolated in the body is inert. It came like a bombshell to the prosecution, so bewildering was the discovery. Inert? Cried Kilgore and Hollins almost together. It can't be. You are making sport of the best chemical experts that money could obtain. Inert? Read the evidence. Read the books. On the contrary, resumed Craig, ignoring the interruption, all the reactions obtained by the experts have been duplicated by me. But, in addition, I tried this one test which they did not try. I repeat, the quinine isolated in the body is inert. We were too perplexed to question him. Alkaloids, he continued quietly, as you know, have names that end in or "-ine, morphine, strychnine, and so on. Now, there are 2 kinds of alkaloids, which are sometimes called vegetable and animal. Moreover, there is a large class of which we are learning much, which are called the ptomaines, from toma, a corpse. Ptomaine poisoning, as everyone knows, results when we eat food that has begun to decay. Ptomaines are chemical compounds of an alkaloidal nature formed in protein substances during putrefaction. They are purely chemical bodies and differ from the toxins. There are also what are called leucomaines, forming in living tissues, and when not given off by the body, they produce auto-intoxication. There are more than 70 ptomaines, and half of them are poisonous. In fact, illness due to eating infected foods is much more common than is generally supposed. Often there is only one case in a number of those eating the food, due merely to that person's inability to throw off the poison. Such cases are difficult to distinguish. They are usually supposed to be gastroenteritis. Ptomaines, as their name shows, are found in dead bodies. They are found in all dead matter after a time, whether it is decayed food or a decayed corpse. No general reaction is known by which the ptomaines can be distinguished from the vegetable alkaloids. But we know that animal alkaloids always develop either as a result of decay of food or of the decay of the body itself. At one stroke, Kennedy had reopened the closed case and had placed the experts at sea. I find that there is an animal conine as well as the true conine, he hammered out. The truth of this matter is that the experts have confounded vegetable conine with cadaveric conine. That raises an interesting question. Assuming the presence of conine, where did it come from? He paused and began a new line of attack. As the use of canned goods becomes more and more extensive, ptomaine poisoning is more frequent. In canning, the cans are heated. They are composed of thin sheets of iron coated with tin, the seams pressed and soldered with a thin line of solder. They are filled with cooked food, sterilized and closed. The bacteria are usually all killed, but now and then the apparatus does not work, and they develop in the can. That results in a blown can. The edges bulge a little bit. On opening, a gas escapes. The food has a bad odor and a bad taste. Sometimes people say that the tin and lead poison them. In practically all cases, the poisoning is of bacterial, not metallic origin. Mr. Godwin may have died of poisoning, probably did, but it was ptomaine poisoning. The blown cans which I have discovered would indicate that. I was following him closely. Yet, though this seemed to explain a part of the case, it was far from explaining all. Then followed, he hurried on, the development of the usual ptomaines in the body itself. These, I may say, had no relation to the cause of death itself. The putrefactive germs begin their attack. Whatever there may have been in the body before, certainly they produced a cadaveric ptomaine conine. For many animal tissues and fluids, especially if somewhat decomposed, yield not infrequently compounds of an oily nature with a mousy odor, fuming with hydrochloric acid, and, in short, acting just like conine. There is ample evidence I have found that conine, or a substance possessing most, if not all, of its properties, is at times actually produced in animal tissues by decomposition. And the fact is, I believe, that a number of cases have arisen in which the poisonous alkaloid was at first supposed to have been discovered, which were really mistakes. The idea was startling in the extreme. Here was Kennedy, as it were, overturning what had been considered the last word in science, as it had been laid down by the experts for the prosecution, opinions so impregnable that courts and juries had not hesitated to condemn a man to death. There have been cases, Craig went on solemnly, and I believe this to be one, where death has been pronounced to have been caused by willful administration of a vegetable alkaloid, which toxicologists would now put down as ptomaine poisoning cases. Innocent people have possibly already suffered and may in the future. But medical experts, he laid special stress on the word, are much more alive to the danger of mistakes than formerly. This was a case where the danger was not considered, either through carelessness, ignorance, or prejudice. Indeed, ptomaines are present probably to a greater or less extent in every organ which is submitted to the toxicologist for examination. If he is ignorant of the nature of these substances, he may easily mistake them for vegetable alkaloids. He may report a given poison present when it is not present. It is even yet a new line of inquiry which has only recently been followed, and the information is still comparatively small and inadequate. It is very difficult, perhaps impossible, for the chemist to state absolutely that he has detected true quinine. Before he can do it, the symptoms and the post-mortem appearance must agree. Analysis must be made before, not after decomposition sets in, and the amount of the poison found must be sufficient to experiment with, not merely to react to a few usual tests. What the experts asserted so positively, I would not dare to assert. Was he killed by ordinary ptomaine poisoning? And had quinine, or rather its double, developed first in his food, along with other ptomaines that were not inert? Or did the cadaveric quinine develop only in the body after death? Chemistry alone cannot decide the question so glibly as the experts did. Further proof must be sought. Other sciences must come to our aid. I was sitting next to Mrs. Godwin. As Kennedy's words rang out, her hand, trembling with emotion, pressed my arm. I turned quickly to see if she needed assistance. Her face was radiant. All the fees for big cases in the world could never have compensated Kennedy for the mute, unrestrained gratitude which the little woman shot at him. Kennedy saw it, and in the quick shifting of his eyes to my face, I read that he relied on me to take care of Mrs. Godwin while he plunged again into the clearing up of the mystery. "I have here the will, the second one," he snapped out, turning and facing the others in the room. Craig turned a switch in an apparatus which his students had brought from New York. From a tube on the table came a peculiar bluish light. "This," he explained, "is a source of ultraviolet rays. They are not the bluish light which you see, but rays contained in it which you cannot see. Ultraviolet rays have recently been found very valuable in the examination of questioned documents. By the use of a lens made of quartz covered with a thin film of metallic silver, there has been developed a practical means of making photographs by the invisible rays of light above the spectrum, these ultraviolet rays. The quartz lens is necessary because these rays will not pass through ordinary glass, while the silver film acts as a screen to cut off the ordinary light rays and those below the spectrum. By this means, most white objects are photographed black, and even transparent objects, like glass, are black. I obtained the copy of this will, but under the condition from the surrogate that absolutely nothing must be done to it to change a fiber of the paper or a line of a letter. It was a difficult condition. While there are chemicals which are frequently resorted to for testing the authenticity of disputed documents, such as wills and deeds, their use frequently injures or destroys the paper under test. So far as I could determine, the document also defied the microscope. But ultraviolet photography does not affect the document tested in any way. and it has lately been used practically in detecting forgeries. I have photographed the last page of the will with its signatures, and here it is. What the eye itself cannot see, the invisible light reveals. He was holding the document and the copy just an instant, as if considering how to announce with best effect what he had discovered. "In order to unravel this mystery," he resumed, looking up and facing the Elmores, Kilgore, and Holland squarely, "I decided to find out whether anyone had had access to that closet where the will was hidden. It was long ago, and there seemed to be little that I could do. I knew it was useless to look for fingerprints. So I used what we detectives now call the law of suggestion. I questioned closely one who was in touch with all those who might have had such access. I hinted broadly at seeking fingerprints, which might lead to the identity of one who had entered the house unknown to the Godwins, and placed a document where private detectives would subsequently find it under suspicious circumstances. Naturally, it would seem to one who was guilty of such an act, or knew of it, that there might, after all, be fingerprints. I tried it. I found out through this little tube, the detectivescope, that one really entered the room after that and tried to wipe off any supposed fingerprints that might still remain. That settled it. The second will was a forgery, and the person who entered that room so stealthily this afternoon knows that it is a forgery." As Kennedy slapped down on the table the film from his camera, which had been concealed, Mrs. Godwin turned her now large and unnaturally bright eyes and met those of the other woman in the room. "Oh, heaven help us! I mean, cried Miriam, unable to bear the strain of the turn of events longer. "I knew there would be retribution. I knew. Mrs. Godwin was on her feet in a moment. "Once my intuition was not wrong, though all science and law was against me," she pleaded with Kennedy. There was a gentleness in her tone that fell like a soft rain on the surging passions of those who had wronged her so shamefully. "Professor Kennedy, Miriam could not have forged." Kennedy smiled. "Science was not against you, Mrs. Godwin. Ignorance was against you, and your intuition does not go contrary to science this time either." It was a splendid exhibition of fine feeling which Kennedy waited to have impressed on the Elmores, as though burning it into their minds. Miriam Elmore knew that her brothers had forged a will and hidden it. To expose them was to convict them of a crime. She kept their secret, which was the secret of all three. She even tried to hide the fingerprints which would have branded her brothers. For ptomaine poisoning had unexpectedly hastened the end of old Mr. Godwin. Then gossip and the scientists did the rest. It was accidental, but Bradford and Lambert Elmore were willing to let events take their course and declare genuine the forgery which they had made so skillfully, even though it convicted an innocent man of murder and killed his faithful wife. As soon as the courts can be set in motion to correct an error of science by the truth of later science, Sing Sing will lose one prisoner from the death house and gain 2 forgers in his place. Mrs. Godwin stood before us, radiant. But as Kennedy's last words sank into her mind, her face clouded. Must Must it be an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? She pleaded eagerly. Must that grim prison take in others, even if my husband goes free? Kennedy looked at her, long and earnestly, as if to let the beauty of her character, trained by its long suffering, impress itself on his mind indelibly. He shook his head slowly. I'm afraid there is no other way, Mrs. Godwin, he said gently, taking her arm and leaving the others to be dealt with by a constable whom he had dozing in the hotel lobby. Con is going up to Albany to get the pardon. There can be no doubt about it now, he added. Mrs. Godwin, if you care to do so, you may stay here at the hotel, or you may go down with us on the midnight train as far as Ossining. I will wire ahead for a conveyance to meet you at the station. Mr. Jameson and I must go on to New York. The nearer I am to Sanford now, the happier I shall be, she answered, bravely keeping back the tears of happiness. The ride down to New York after our train left Ossining was accomplished in a day coach in which our fellow passengers slept in every conceivable attitude of discomfort. Yet late, or rather early as it was, we found plenty of life still in the great city that never sleeps. Tired, exhausted, I was at least glad to feel that finally we were at home. Craig! Oh, I yawned as I began to throw off my clothes. I'm ready to sleep a week. There was no answer. I looked up at him almost resentfully. He had picked up the mail that lay under our letter slot and was going through it as eagerly as if the clock registered P.M. instead of A.M. Let me see, I mumbled sleepily, checking over my notes. How many days have we been at it? I turned the pages slowly after the manner in which my mind was working. It was the 26th when you got that letter from Ossining, I calculated, and today makes the 13th. My heavens! Is there still another day of it? Is there no rest for the wicked? Kennedy looked up and laughed. He was pointing at the calendar on the desk before him. There are only 30 days in the month, he remarked slowly. Thank the Lord, I exclaimed. I'm all in. He tipped his desk chair back and bit the amber of his meerschaum contemplatively. But today is the 1st, he drawled, turning the leaf on the calendar with just a flicker of a smile. The end. End of The Dream Doctor by Arthur B. Reeve. Reading by Tommy Hersant, Carlsbad, California.